We spend much of our lives waiting for someone to arrive, to notice us, to fix what is broken, to validate what we have done, to rescue us from the consequences of our own inaction. And this waiting becomes so habitual that we rarely stop to examine the simple and unavoidable truth that nobody is actually coming. When you are unemployed and facing financial ruin, no cosmic force will intervene to deliver a job to your doorstep. When your relationships are deteriorating from neglect, no external agent will repair them while you remain passive. When your health declines from years of poor choices, no savior materializes to restore your vitality. And yet we continue to defer action as though we are waiting for permission or rescue that will somehow manifest from the universe. The mechanism behind this is partly neurological and partly cultural, rooted in childhood experiences where parents or authority figures did occasionally arrive to solve our problems. And this early conditioning creates a neural pathway that persists long after we have aged into full autonomy. We have also been conditioned by stories, films, and narratives that celebrate the hero who appears at the critical moment, the mentor who shows up when the protagonist needs guidance most, the stroke of luck that saves the day, and these fictional patterns become so deeply embedded in our expectations that we unconsciously model our lives around their arrival. The psychology of it is further reinforced by the anxiety reduction that accompanies the belief that someone else is responsible, because accepting that nobody is coming means accepting full responsibility for the trajectory of your own existence, which is a far heavier burden than hoping for external rescue. We normalize this passivity by surrounding ourselves with others engaged in the same waiting, by creating communities of people who discuss their dreams without pursuing them, who complain about their circumstances without al. Every moment that passes is gone forever, irretrievable and absolute, yet we live as though time is infinite and forgiving, as though we can always do tomorrow what we failed to do today, as though the hours we waste on trivial distractions will somehow be returned to us with interest. We spend years in jobs that hollow us out, in relationships that diminish us, in routines that numb our consciousness, operating under the assumption that there will always be more time ahead, that we are somehow exempt from the basic mathematics of mortality. The mechanism behind this delusion is both neurological and psychological. The human brain struggles to comprehend vast spans of time and tends to discount future consequences in favor of immediate comfort, a survival trait that served our ancestors well when life was short and unpredictable, but now works against us in a world where we might live for decades with the consequences of our choices. We normalize this surrender to endless procrastination by surrounding ourselves with others doing the same thing, by creating cultural narratives that celebrate busy lives and delayed gratification, by telling ourselves that success will come later and that joy can be scheduled for retirement. Yet the brutal truth remains unchanged. Every day you spend in resistance to your own life, every hour you invest in things you do not care about, every moment you choose comfort over growth or approval over authenticity is genuinely gone, subtracted permanently from the only existence you will ever know, and no amount of future success or future happiness can recover what has already been lost. The person who spent 20 years in a career that never mattered to them cannot retrieve those years by finally pursuing their passion at 45. They can only move forward diminished by what was lost. You have probably encountered someone with extraordinary natural ability who never accomplished anything meaningful, and simultaneously, you have known individuals of modest talent who built empires and left legacies that outlasted their own lifetimes. And this observation, though simple on its surface, contains one of the most brutal truths about human existence that we spend our entire lives avoiding. Talent is merely the starting point of potential, a genetic lottery ticket that opens a door, but the door leads nowhere without the willingness to walk through it repeatedly, day after day, year after year, in obscurity and without guarantee of reward. The mechanism at work here is deceptively straightforward. Talent creates an illusion of destiny, a false sense that the universe owes you something because you were born with certain advantages, and this illusion is so intoxicating that it paralyses rather than motivates, because why would you practice relentlessly when you already possess the gift that others desperately lack? Meanwhile, the untalented individual has no such luxury of assumption and must rely entirely on discipline, repetition, failure, learning, and an obsessive commitment to improvement that becomes indistinguishable from their identity itself. We have normalized this cruel inversion to the point where we celebrate talent as if it were accomplishment, where we mistake potential for achievement, where we watch people squander their gifts on comfort and assume they simply never had what it took, when the truth is far more unforgiving. They had everything it took, and they chose not to use it. The world does not care about your capacity. It cares only about what you produce, and talent without production is merely an embarrassing reminder of roads not taken and potential that will die with you, unmourned and unmissed. Consider the person who wakes up in a temperature-controlled room, slides into expensive sheets, and knows exactly what their day will look like before it even begins, because their life has been optimized to eliminate surprise, friction, and uncertainty at every possible turn. They have a good job that pays well enough, a partner who loves them, friends who text regularly, a home that requires no effort to maintain, and streaming services that deliver endless entertainment directly into their consciousness without requiring them to leave their couch or make a single decision of consequence. Their body has forgotten what hunger feels like, what true exhaustion feels like, what it means to be genuinely uncertain about whether your basic needs will be met tomorrow. This is the architecture of modern comfort, and it is perhaps the most effective dream-killing technology ever invented by human civilization. The mechanism is simple and operates beneath conscious awareness. The human brain evolved under conditions of scarcity, uncertainty, and genuine threat, which meant that survival required constant adaptation, learning, and growth. When you remove these pressures entirely, when you create an environment where nothing truly demands your evolution, your brain has no biological imperative to dream, to strive, or to become more than you currently are. Dreams require tension, the gap between who you are and who you want to be, but comfort systematically closes that gap by offering a life that feels complete enough, good enough, satisfying enough in its present form. We have normalized this death of aspiration by calling it success, by celebrating stability as the ultimate achievement, by treating contentment as wisdom rather than recognizing it as a trap that slowly erases your sense of possibility. You spend months working on a project, pouring your energy and creativity into something you believe matters, and when you finally present it to the world, people acknowledge it, praise it even, and then within days or weeks it vanishes from their consciousness as though it never existed at all. You post something meaningful on social media, something you crafted carefully and shared vulnerably, and it receives attention for a fleeting moment before being buried beneath an endless avalanche of new content, new distractions, new things competing for the finite attention of others. You do someone a favor, you sacrifice your time or resources to help them through a difficult period, and they thank you sincerely in that moment, but 6 months later, when you encounter them again, they have forgotten not just the details, but the fundamental fact that you were there for them at all. This happens not because people are inherently ungrateful or cruel, but because the human mind simply cannot retain everything it encounters, and so it prioritizes ruthlessly and unconsciously, keeping only what feels immediately relevant or emotionally charged. Memory is not a recording device but a reconstruction, constantly being rewritten and overwritten, shaped by what we need to believe about ourselves and our lives in any given moment. The mechanism behind this forgetting is actually quite elegant from an evolutionary perspective. A brain that held onto every interaction, every casual comment, every minor contribution would become paralyzed by information overload, unable to function in the present because it was too busy cataloging the past. And yet we continue to live as though people will remember, as though our contributions will persist in the minds of others, as though the things we do and say and create will echo forward through time. Consider the person who tells you they value their health above all else, yet their schedule reveals no time for exercise, their refrigerator contains only processed foods, and they haven't seen a doctor in years. Consider the individual who claims to be deeply committed to their relationships, yet they scroll through their phone during conversations, forget important dates without hesitation, and postpone plans repeatedly until those people stop asking. Consider the organization that espouses innovation and employee well-being in their mission statement, while their actual budget allocations reveal that training and development receive minimal funding compared to executive bonuses and shareholder returns. What we actually do, moment by moment and day by day, represents the truest expression of our actual values and priorities, far more than any words we could ever speak or write. The psychological mechanism underlying this reality is simple and immutable. Actions require commitment of finite resources including time, energy, money, and attention, while words require virtually none of these things. We can say we care about something without paying any price, but to do something meaningful about it demands real sacrifice and real choice. This is why actions cut through the noise of our self-deception so cleanly and reveal what we genuinely prioritize beneath all our rationalizations and explanations. Yet despite this obvious truth being visible everywhere around us, we continue to accept elaborate justifications and promises from others and from ourselves, constructing elaborate narratives about intentions and constraints rather than simply observing what someone actually does with the hours available to them. We have somehow normalized the gap between stated values and revealed behavior so thoroughly that we treat obvious contradictions as normal variations of human nature rather than clear evidence of dishonesty or self-delusion. And this AC. No matter how many people surround you, no matter how many friends you accumulate or how many meaningful connections you cultivate throughout your life, there will come moments where you sit alone with your own thoughts and feel an absolute, undeniable separation between yourself and every other human being on this planet. You will be in a room full of laughter and conversation and still feel entirely isolated, as though there is a pane of glass between you and genuine connection. This is not a failure of your social skills or a reflection of how unlikable you are. This is simply the architecture of human consciousness itself. Each person exists within the singular prison of their own mind, experiencing reality through a lens that no one else can ever fully understand or access, no matter how close they become to you. Your inner world, your specific combination of memories, anxieties, desires, and interpretations, belongs entirely to you and you alone. You cannot truly download your subjective experience into another person's brain. The psychologist Carl Rogers recognized this as the fundamental human condition, and loneliness is not something to overcome, but something to accept as part of the basic structure of being alive and aware. We have constructed an entire culture around the denial of this truth, filling every available moment with notification sounds and social media updates and reasons to stay plugged into the collective noise, yet somehow we feel lonelier than ever before. We have normalized the desperate scramble for connection while simultaneously building a world designed to isolate us more effectively than any physical distance ever could. The paradox is that the very technology meant to bring us together has only made clearer the fundamental truth that we were always meant to face alone. That no one else can live your life for you, no one can feel your suffering for you, and no one can know you as completely as you know. There exists a peculiar phenomenon in human life where the period of greatest physical capability, mental flexibility, and biological advantage is consistently squandered on pursuits that do nothing to compound these resources into meaningful advantage. And this pattern repeats across generations without interruption or genuine resistance. A young person possesses energy that returns with sleep, a brain still forming neural pathways with remarkable plasticity, a body resistant to disease and decay, and decades of time stretching ahead like an infinite resource, yet spends these years in ways that would horrify them if they could fast forward and witness the accumulated opportunity cost from the perspective of their future self. They attend school not primarily to build mastery, but to accumulate credentials. They work entry-level jobs not to develop irreplaceable skills, but to pay rent. They consume entertainment not to genuinely rest, but to fill the void of purposelessness. And they pursue social status within peer groups that will become entirely irrelevant within a decade. The mechanism driving this waste is partly structural. Society has created systems that require young people to spend their peak years obtaining permission to use their abilities, in the form of degrees and licenses and experience that older gatekeepers control. But it is also partly psychological, rooted in the inability of young minds to viscerally understand mortality and scarcity when time feels infinite, making it nearly impossible to value hours with the urgency they deserve. What makes this phenomenon particularly insidious is how completely it has been normalized and celebrated, how we have convinced young people that wasting their youth is actually preparation for real life, how we have made it shameful to question whether the decades spent in hallways and cubicles could have been spent differently. You will spend years building friendships, investing time and emotional energy into people who feel permanent, who seem like they will be there indefinitely, and then one day you will realize that most of them are gone. They moved to different cities, they got married and their priorities shifted, they found new friend groups that felt more aligned with their current phase of life, or sometimes there was no dramatic reason at all, just a slow fade where texts became less frequent and invitations stopped coming, and eventually you stopped reaching out too. The friends you thought would last forever simply evaporated from your life like they were never there, and you were left wondering what you did wrong or what changed. The mechanism behind this is simple and almost mathematical in its precision. Friendship, unlike family, requires constant maintenance and proximity and alignment of circumstances to survive. When any of those variables change, the friendship begins to deteriorate. People are not naturally loyal to each other in the way we imagine they are. Loyalty is a choice that requires active effort, and when life gets busy or complicated or when people move through different seasons, that choice becomes harder and harder to make. We tell ourselves we will stay close, that distance and time mean nothing, that real friends endure everything, but these are beautiful lies we tell ourselves in moments of connection. The truth is that most friendships are circumstantial, held together by proximity and shared experience, and when those things disappear, so does the friendship. What is remarkable is how normalized this has become, how we accept it as simply how life works, yet we continue to be shocked and hurt each time it happens, as though we did not already know deep down that this was inevitable. Every person who has achieved something meaningful has experienced the peculiar mathematics of sacrifice, where the equation seems simple on the surface, but becomes infinitely complex the moment you commit to solving it. Consider the surgeon who spent 14 years in training while their peers bought homes and started families, the entrepreneur who worked 70-hour weeks while watching their marriage deteriorate slowly like a photograph left in the sun, or the athlete who missed birthday parties and graduations and first dates because their body was in a gymnasium when their heart wanted to be elsewhere. The sacrifice is real and it is constant, a perpetual choosing between the thing you want to become and the life you could be living right now, knowing that you cannot have both simultaneously, and that time spent on one path is time irrevocably lost from another. What makes this pattern persist is that success, by definition, requires focus, and focus is the antithesis of balance. The human mind cannot distribute its best energy across multiple domains with equal intensity. It must choose, and in choosing, it must abandon. This is not a failure of willpower or planning, but rather a fundamental constraint of human cognition and the nature of competitive advantage itself. We have normalized this sacrifice to such an extent that we barely recognize it anymore, speaking casually about work-life balance, while understanding deeply that nobody who achieves genuine excellence actually achieves it, that the photographs of successful people smiling with their families are taken during the rare moments when they are not working, that the cost of their achievement is stitched invisibly into the fabric of their relationships, and their presence, and their ability to simply be where their body is located. You were taught as a child that fairness was a fundamental principle of how the world operates, that if you worked hard and played by the rules, good things would come to you, and that injustice would eventually be corrected by some invisible hand of cosmic balance. Yet as you've moved through life, you've witnessed countless moments where the hardest workers struggle endlessly while the mediocre rise effortlessly, where the kind are exploited and the cruel prosper, where circumstances of birth determine outcomes far more than merit or effort ever could. Two people can work identical jobs with identical performance, yet one receives promotion while the other stagnates, not because of anything they did differently, but because one had a connection, or the right last name, or simply caught the right person's attention on the right day. A child born into wealth can fail repeatedly and still land on their feet, while a child born into poverty must be flawless just to tread water, and we accept this arrangement as though it were written into the laws of physics rather than constructed by human systems designed to perpetuate themselves. The mechanism behind this is simple. Fairness is a concept that only exists in our minds and in our social agreements, not in nature itself. Nature operates on the basis of power, resources, and proximity to advantage, not on some cosmic scoreboard tracking who deserves what. We invented fairness as a regulatory principle to make societies function more smoothly and to reduce conflict, but the system that emerged still reflects the preferences and biases of whoever holds power, making fairness an aspiration rather than a reality. What persists despite having no logical reason is our continued shock at unfairness, our outrage when we encounter it, as though we still believe deep down that the universe cares about equity. Every day, people make promises they never keep, declare intentions they immediately forget, and speak commitments that dissolve the moment the conversation ends. A friend says they will call you next week and never does. A colleague swears they will send you that document and it never arrives. A partner promises to change and falls back into the same patterns within days. We live in a world drowning in empty utterances, where words have become so abundant and so consequence-free that they have lost almost all of their actual value. The human mouth produces endless streams of language, most of it signifying nothing beyond the momentary relief of having said it aloud. People speak to fill silence, to appear committed, to satisfy social expectations, to create the illusion that they are taking action when they are actually doing nothing at all. The mechanism behind this is simple and deeply human. Words cost nothing. They require no real sacrifice, no genuine effort, no actual change in behavior or circumstance. You can promise the world without moving an inch. You can declare your deepest intentions without lifting a finger toward them. The gap between what we say and what we do has become so normalized that we barely acknowledge it exists anymore. We have constructed an entire culture where verbal commitment is treated as equivalent to actual commitment, where saying you will do something has become socially acceptable as a substitute for actually doing it. We reward people for their words all the time, for their inspirational speeches, their heartfelt declarations, their passionate statements about their future plans, while we ignore the vast distance between those words and the concrete reality of their actions. This contradiction persists because acknowledging it would require us to confront the uncomfortable truth that most of what we say means nothing, and that we ourselves are constantly failing to honor our own words. You wake up each morning with a finite reserve of mental and physical energy, and the moment you begin your day, that reserve begins to deplete with every decision you make, every conversation you have, and every task you undertake, whether significant or trivial. You might notice that after a full day of work, you lack the motivation to exercise, or after an emotionally demanding conversation, you find yourself unable to focus on creative projects. And this is not weakness or laziness, but rather a simple biological reality that your body and mind operate on limited resources that must be allocated strategically throughout each day. The mechanism behind this constraint is fundamentally rooted in the physical and neurochemical processes that govern human functioning. As your brain consumes approximately 20% of your body's total energy despite comprising only 2% of your body weight, and every cognitive task, from solving complex problems to resisting temptation to maintaining emotional regulation, draws from the same limited pools of glucose and neurotransmitters that your body produces in measured quantities. Yet despite understanding this basic truth about human physiology, most people operate as though their energy is infinite, scheduling back-to-back meetings, committing to multiple obligations, pushing through fatigue rather than respecting it, and then feeling ashamed when they inevitably collapse or perform poorly, never quite grasping that the problem is not their character or determination, but rather their fundamental misalignment with biological reality. We have normalized the culture of endless productivity and perpetual availability, treating rest as laziness and energy management as an excuse, when in fact honoring your energy limits is not a personal failing, but an act of rational self-awareness that distinguishes those who sustain meaningful performance over decades from those who burn out after years of ignoring. Consider the child who touches a hot stove and withdraws their hand in an instant, the burn seared into their memory far more permanently than any warning from a parent could ever achieve, the lesson encoded directly into their nervous system through the language of suffering. This is pain as a teacher, and it operates through a mechanism so primal and effective that our entire biological evolution has built itself around it. When we experience pain, whether physical or emotional, the brain prioritizes this information above almost everything else because pain signals danger, and danger demands immediate behavioral modification. The memory of pain becomes sticky in ways that intellectual knowledge simply cannot replicate, and this is because pain activates multiple neural pathways simultaneously, creating redundant storage systems that ensure we do not repeat the mistake that caused it. We learn that certain people cannot be trusted not through logical analysis, but through the sting of betrayal. We understand our limits not through theoretical discussion, but through the exhaustion of pushing beyond them. We discover what truly matters to us not through meditation, but through the sharp loss of it. The mechanism is undeniable and its effectiveness is absolute, yet we have constructed entire institutions and philosophies around avoiding pain rather than respecting it as our most honest teacher. We medicate it away before it can speak. We distract ourselves from it through endless consumption. We shame ourselves for feeling it and pretend that those who suffer less have somehow achieved greater wisdom. And yet pain persists as the most reliable educator available to us. the only teacher who cannot be fooled by our ego, the only curriculum that we genuinely cannot forget, sitting quietly at the edges of our comfortable lives waiting for the moment when we finally stop running long enough to listen. Consider the moment when you stand at the edge of a decision, trembling with uncertainty about whether to take a chance on something that matters to you. In that instant, fear feels like the dominant force in your body, a visceral and overwhelming sensation that convinces you the risk is too great, that the potential for failure or rejection or loss is so catastrophic that inaction becomes the safer choice. You decide not to speak up in the meeting, not to ask the person out, not to pursue the unconventional career path, not to have the difficult conversation with someone you love. Fear wins, and you retreat into the familiar territory of what you already know. But here is the brutal mechanism at work. Fear is designed to be temporary and situational. It responds to immediate threats and dissipates once you move past the moment of decision, or once you realize the threat was never as dangerous as your mind predicted. Fear fades because it served its evolutionary purpose in that specific moment. Regret, however, operates on an entirely different timeline and with an entirely different psychological structure. Regret is the slow, persistent ache that settles into your consciousness long after the fear has evaporated, and it compounds over years rather than diminishing. Every time you encounter a similar situation in the future, regret whispers to you about the last time you chose fear, building a narrative of missed opportunity and self-limitation that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. You can live 10 years with a decision made in 10 seconds of fear, but you can live 50 years with the quiet devastation of never knowing what could have happened. The cruelest aspect of this lesson is that we have somehow normalized this inversion of priorities, accepting that temporary fear should override lasting consequence as though this were a reasonable trade. You wake up and immediately your mind fills with the day's tasks, and you move through your morning with a sense of urgency that feels almost moral, as though the speed of your motion somehow validates your existence, and you arrive at work or your desk ready to tackle everything at once, checking emails while responding to messages while starting 3 different projects. And by noon you feel exhausted in a way that seems to confirm you have worked hard, that you have earned your fatigue through sheer effort and dedication. Yet when you pause to examine what you have actually completed, the answer is surprisingly little. This is the fundamental deception of busyness, the way that motion masquerades as progress, the way that doing many things simultaneously creates the illusion of accomplishment while often producing mediocre results across the board. The mechanism is surprisingly simple once you understand it. Your brain releases dopamine when you complete tasks, small or large, and busyness provides a constant stream of small completions, checking items off lists, responding to notifications, moving from one thing to another, and this creates a reward loop that feels productive even when it is merely performative, even when you are simply rearranging the same problems without solving any of them. The real work of the world is rarely urgent and rarely visible in the moment of its completion. It requires sustained focus and deep concentration on single objectives, the kind of work that feels boring compared to the stimulation of constant switching and multitasking. Yet this invisible work is what actually builds things, what moves projects forward, what creates real value. We have normalized busyness as a proxy for importance, as though the busier you are, the more valuable you must be, when in reality busyness is often the refuge of those who are avoiding the harder task of deciding what actually matters, and we have built entire cultures. You have likely experienced the moment when someone who has deeply hurt you offers an apology, and in that instant you feel a strange pressure to accept it, to nod, to say that everything is fine, that you understand that they are forgiven. The apology arrives with such apparent sincerity that it seems to possess transformative power, as though the mere utterance of regret could retroactively alter what was done, could erase the damage, could restore what was broken. Yet when you sit with this moment in honest silence, you begin to realize that nothing has actually changed. The words are wind, the apology does not heal the wound, it does not return the time that was lost, the trust that was shattered, the opportunities that were sacrificed because of their actions. The person who apologized is the same person who committed the harm. Their character remains unchanged. Their capacity to hurt you again remains completely intact. We have constructed an elaborate social fiction in which apologies serve as a kind of emotional reset button, but this fiction obscures a harder truth. Apologies primarily serve the person offering them. An apology allows someone to feel absolved, to believe they have done the moral work of repair, when in reality they have only spoken words. Meanwhile, you are often expected to provide the reassurance they need, to tell them they are still a good person, to relieve them of the discomfort of genuine accountability. What apologies actually do is create a temporary emotional transaction where regret is exchanged for forgiveness, and the machinery of social interaction continues uninterrupted. The real repair would require changed behavior over time, consistent demonstration of different choices, and sustained evidence that the person has fundamentally altered how they operate in the world. This is rare. Consider the person who has known you for a single week and already expects you to confide your deepest secrets, to lend them money without question, to prioritize their needs above your own, and to believe every word they speak without hesitation. You would find this absurd. You would recognize immediately that trust is not something that arrives with introduction or accumulates through proximity alone. Yet we live in a world obsessed with the illusion of instant connection, where social media algorithms convince us we know people we have never met, where we mistake familiarity for intimacy, and where we feel betrayed when someone we barely knew proves themselves untrustworthy. The mechanism underlying this reality is straightforward and rooted in repeated evidence. Trust emerges through consistent behavior observed across time and varied circumstances. When someone acts with integrity when no one is watching, when they follow through on small commitments before large ones, when they demonstrate the same values in private that they display in public, when they handle your vulnerability with respect rather than weaponizing it, then trust can begin to form. This accumulation requires years because humans are complex creatures capable of maintaining facades, and because trust, once broken, becomes exponentially harder to rebuild than to establish initially. What persists despite its logical necessity is our desperate hunger to compress this timeline. We want to skip the patient observation and jump directly to the belonging we crave. We want to believe that because someone makes us feel understood in a conversation, they have earned access to our lives. We want to assume that because someone is charming or attentive during our interactions, they will not betray us when it becomes convenient. And so we rush trust, and then we suffer the consequences of having given something precious to someone who had not yet proven themselves worthy of it. You can spend years building a reputation, carefully cultivating how others perceive you, making deliberate choices to demonstrate competence, integrity, and reliability, only to have it demolished in a single moment by one mistake, one misstatement, one poor decision, or one accusation that spreads faster than your ability to defend yourself. Consider the professional who has spent 2 decades earning respect in their field, only to have a single ethical lapse or a controversial statement made in a private conversation suddenly exposed to the world, instantly transforming them from trusted authority to cautionary tale in the minds of countless people who never knew them at all. The disparity is remarkable because reputation operates on an entirely irrational asymmetry where trust is built slowly through consistent action, but destroyed instantly through the perception of inconsistency. And this asymmetry exists because human beings evaluate others primarily through the lens of protection and fear rather than fairness and proportion. We remember the one time someone disappointed us far more vividly than the 100 times they came through for us, because our brains are wired to detect threats and deviations from expected patterns, not to maintain balanced accounting of overall character. The fragility persists despite our intellectual understanding that no person is perfect, that everyone makes mistakes, that context matters, and that a single incident should not erase years of demonstrated behavior. Yet we continue to judge others and ourselves with this impossible standard anyway. We see it everywhere from public figures whose careers evaporate overnight to ordinary people who discover that a relationship they thought was solid was actually dependent on one person maintaining a particular image, and the moment that image cracks, everything shifts. Your body does not announce its deterioration with fanfare or warning signs that demand immediate attention. Instead, it whispers its decline across months and years, sending signals so subtle that you mistake them for normal aging, for the expected wear of living, for something that will resolve itself tomorrow when you finally get around to addressing it. You feel slightly more tired than last year, but you attribute this to stress or work or the natural heaviness of adult responsibility. Your joints creak in ways they did not before, yet you ignore them because the pain is not sharp enough to interrupt your day, only dull enough to be present in the background of your consciousness like ambient noise you have learned to filter out. Your sleep becomes less restorative even as you spend the same hours in bed, but you do not examine this change because examining it would require acknowledging that something has shifted in the machinery of your own physiology. The The decline of health is fundamentally different from other failures in your life because it operates on a timeline that exceeds the limits of human perception and denial. You cannot see the slow narrowing of your arteries or the gradual inflammation spreading through your tissues or the cumulative effect of 10,000 small choices finally reaching a critical mass. By the time you feel sick enough to seek help, the foundation has often already crumbled beneath you. We normalize this silence because we have constructed a society that systematically discourages the constant vigilance that true health maintenance would require. To stay healthy is to engage in behaviors that produce no immediate gratification and no visible results, actions that feel pointless precisely because they work and prevent problems you never see manifest. You exercise today and feel no different tomorrow, so the rational mind questions why you should continue. Consider the person working a job they despise, spending 8 hours daily in an office or warehouse or retail space doing tasks that drain their energy and erode their sense of self. And then consider the person with substantial wealth who has delegated nearly every obligation away. The wealthy individual outsources their cooking, their cleaning, their yard work, their administrative tasks, their errands, their travel arrangements, all of it handed to someone else so that their hours remain theirs alone. This is not merely about comfort or convenience. This is the fundamental conversion of currency into the hours of your own life. When you pay someone to clean your home, you are not buying cleanliness. You are buying back the time you would have spent on your hands and knees with a scrub brush. When you pay for expedited shipping instead of waiting 3 weeks, you are purchasing those weeks back from the void. When you hire an accountant instead of wrestling with tax forms yourself, you are buying the mental space and the hours you would have surrendered to confusion and frustration. The mechanism is straightforward. Every dollar you spend on outsourcing is a dollar that purchases someone else's labor instead of your own, and since your time on this earth is finite and non-renewable, this becomes the most honest equation in human economics. Yet we have somehow normalized the desperation of those without money, who must spend their evenings and weekends managing every detail of their own survival, while we barely acknowledge the luxury of those who have simply purchased their way out of the relentless machinery of daily maintenance. We accept that the wealthy have more time, more rest, more space for thought and creation and leisure, as though this were a natural law rather than a direct function of money. The cruel irony persists. Money buys time, and time is the only currency that matters. Imagine watching a friend receive praise for an accomplishment that you had quietly hoped for yourself, and in that moment, something shifts inside you, a tightness in your chest, a sharpness in your thoughts, an almost involuntary sting of resentment that arrives before you can rationalize it away. This is jealousy in its purest form, and what makes it particularly instructive is that it functions as an emotional mirror held up to our own souls, reflecting back to us the things we actually want but have perhaps been unwilling to fully acknowledge. When we feel jealous of someone else's success, their relationship, their appearance, or their freedom, we are not actually envying them at all in any genuine sense. We are confronting a desire within ourselves that we had kept in shadow, buried beneath layers of rationalization about what we should want or what is realistic for us to pursue. The jealousy itself is merely the alert system, the psychological alarm bell that rings when we encounter something that matters to us more than we consciously admitted. If you feel no jealousy towards someone's achievement, it is simply because you do not truly desire that thing, and this clarity, though sometimes uncomfortable, is actually invaluable information about your authentic self. Yet we have been conditioned to see jealousy only as a character flaw, a sign of pettiness or weakness, something to suppress and deny rather than to examine and learn from. We apologize for our jealous feelings as if they were moral failures, when in reality they are opportunities for radical honesty about what we actually value, what we actually want our lives to contain, and where the gap exists between our real desires and our current reality. This gap, once recognized, becomes actionable. It becomes the roadmap toward genuine change rather than the source of silent suffering. You stand at 22 years old with the world theoretically open before you, and people tell you that you have unlimited potential, that you can become anything, that your youth is your greatest asset, and you believe them because everyone says it, and because there is a kind of truth to it when you are young enough that the statistical probability of becoming almost anything still feels real rather than merely mathematical. But something happens between that moment of unlimited potential and your early 30s, and it is not that the world suddenly becomes harder or that opportunities dry up entirely, but rather that potential itself becomes something that decays like a perishable good with an expiration date printed somewhere you cannot quite see. The person who postpones learning an instrument until they are 30 who decides that they might study medicine at 35, who thinks they could still become a professional athlete at 40, discovers that potential was not actually infinite, but rather a diminishing asset that depreciates with each year spent doing something else. And this is partially biological because our brains do have windows for certain kinds of learning, but it is also social and psychological because potential requires belief. And belief requires time, and time spent proving you are good at one thing makes it psychologically harder to believe you could become excellent at something completely different. We have normalized this expiration date so thoroughly that we barely notice it exists, telling people in their 20s to find their passion while simultaneously understanding, without saying it aloud, that if you have not begun the serious cultivation of a meaningful skill by 30, you are unlikely to reach the highest levels in that domain. And we treat this as natural law rather than as a consequence of how we have structured society and work and the economics of building expertise. You watch someone you care about walk straight into a problem you have already solved, and you offer them the solution with genuine intention to help, but they nod politely and proceed anyway into the exact suffering you warned them about. And then months later they call you frustrated and confused about why things turned out exactly as you predicted. Yet somehow this cycle continues endlessly because people are fundamentally convinced that their circumstances are unique and that the wisdom accumulated by others does not apply to their specific situation. The mechanism behind this is surprisingly simple. We all believe ourselves to be exceptions to the rules that govern everyone else, and we confuse listening with agreeing, which means we can hear advice perfectly clearly while simultaneously deciding it does not pertain to us. We think we are receiving information when we are actually conducting a performance for the person giving the advice, nodding along while our actual decision has already been made in the chambers of our ego, where we have decided that our intuition, our judgment, or our circumstances are special enough to supersede the lessons of others. What makes this particularly brutal is that advice is often most valuable when we are least willing to take it, because the people who desperately need to hear something are exactly the people most convinced they are the exception, most certain their case is different, most resistant to the uncomfortable truth that they are about to make a mistake everyone else has already made. And so we normalize this rejection of wisdom by framing it as independence and personal journey and learning through experience, when really it is just the stubborn insistence on paying tuition to a lesson that was already being offered for free, and we tell ourselves that at least we will learn something in the process, which is true, but only after we have paid a price far steeper than simply listening would. Most people move through life expecting that significant events will conclude with clear resolution, a final conversation that ties loose ends, an explanation that makes sense of what happened, or at minimum some formal acknowledgement that a chapter has ended. Yet the reality is that closure, in the way we imagine it, arrives far less often than we encounter situations that simply fade into ambiguity and silence. Relationships end not with the conversation you rehearsed, but with someone who gradually stops responding to messages, or worse, with no conversation at all. Jobs terminate through email or a brief meeting with human resources, leaving you with unanswered questions about performance or company decisions. Friendships dissolve not through conflict resolution, but through the slow dissolution of effort, where texts become less frequent, invitations stop arriving, and one day you realize you no longer speak to someone who once occupied your entire social world. Family rifts continue across decades without the apology or explanation everyone claims they wish for, and people eventually stop waiting for it because acceptance arrives before resolution ever does. The mechanism behind this absence of closure lies in the fundamental asymmetry between what closure requires and what most people are willing or capable of providing. Closure demands vulnerability, accountability, and the willingness to revisit pain that others have already moved past or buried. It requires someone to sit with discomfort long enough to articulate their role in what happened, to listen to how their actions affected someone else, and to engage in emotional labor that feels purposeless when the relationship has already ended. Most people lack either the emotional capacity, the self-awareness, or the motivation to provide this, and so they simply move forward, allowing the other person to remain suspended in a state of incompletion. You can be the most talented person in the room, possessing years of refined expertise, deep knowledge, and genuine mastery of your craft, yet find yourself completely overshadowed by someone far less skilled who simply arrived at the right moment when the world was ready to receive what they had to offer. A musician with perfect pitch and decades of training might spend their entire life in obscurity, while a mediocre performer with a catchy song, released at the exact cultural moment when that sound is needed, becomes a household name within months. An entrepreneur with a brilliant business model but poor timing will watch their company struggle and fail, while a competitor with an inferior product but superior timing captures the entire market and builds an empire. The brutal truth is that timing operates on a plane entirely separate from skill, and no amount of preparation, discipline, or talent can fully compensate for being out of sync with the world's appetite for what you offer. This happens because markets, trends, and human attention follow patterns that are only partially predictable, and they reward those who align themselves with these currents regardless of whether those individuals are the most deserving. We witness this pattern repeatedly across industries, yet we continue to believe that hard work and excellence alone will guarantee success, clinging to a meritocratic fantasy that has been repeatedly disproven by history. The persistence of this belief, despite overwhelming counter-evidence, suggests that acknowledging timing's supremacy would be emotionally unbearable, forcing us to confront the randomness and injustice embedded in how opportunity actually distributes itself across human lives. Better to believe that our failures stem from insufficient skill than to accept that we might have possessed everything required but simply lived in the wrong era. There is a peculiar dynamic in human relationships where the person who gives the most often receives the least in return, and this pattern repeats itself so consistently across cultures and contexts that it begins to feel like an immutable law of nature rather than a choice we are collectively making. When you're kind to someone, when you show up consistently, when you offer your time and energy without keeping score, you signal to that person that you have reserves they can draw from, and what happens next is almost mechanical in its predictability. They will ask for more. They will begin to expect the kindness as a baseline rather than a gift, and when you finally reach your limit and set a boundary, they will react with confusion or hurt, as though you have suddenly become cruel when in fact you have simply stopped being infinitely generous. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally about reciprocal altruism and the way human beings learn through reinforcement. If a behavior goes rewarded, we repeat it. If we can take from someone without consequence or guilt, we continue taking, especially if that person has demonstrated that they will not retaliate or withdraw their care. Kind people often struggle with confrontation, which means they rarely punish poor behavior directly, and thus the exploiter faces no real cost for their actions. They benefit enormously from the arrangement. What makes this truly brutal is that kindness itself becomes a vulnerability, a sign that can be read by those looking to minimize their own effort or maximize their own benefit. We have normalized this exploitation to such a degree that we often blame the kind person for their own misuse, telling them they should have been more selfish, should have protected themselves better, should have known that generosity would be weaponized against them. You set a boundary with someone and you feel relief, as though the hard part is finished, but the boundary itself is not the finish line, but rather the starting line of an entirely different struggle that most people never anticipate. The moment you establish a limit, a rule, a line that cannot be crossed, you immediately enter into a phase where that boundary will be tested, probed, and challenged by the very people it was designed to protect you from, because human beings have a fundamental resistance to constraints that limit their access to what they want. Consider the parent who tells their child that bedtime is 9 o'clock, only to find the child returning repeatedly with requests for water, stories, and explanations. Each attempt a small test of whether the boundary holds or whether the parent will dissolve it under the weight of persistence and emotional manipulation. The psychological mechanism at work here is deceptively simple. People push against boundaries because they evolved in environments where resources were scarce and competition was constant. So capitulating and testing the limits of others became a survival strategy encoded into our behavioral repertoire. A colleague who agrees to respect your work hours will still email you at midnight and call you on weekends because they have never experienced a consequence substantial enough to override their impulse to demand access. And without enforcement, their agreement becomes merely decorative, a performance of respect without the substance. The enforcement of boundaries requires something most people are deeply uncomfortable with: the willingness to disappoint others, to say no repeatedly to the same request, to tolerate their anger or withdrawal or guilt trips, and to accept that maintaining your limit might cost you the relationship with that person. When someone criticizes you harshly, what they are often doing is describing themselves. their fears, their failures, or the things they most despise about their own character. And in that moment of projection, they are externally processing their internal shame by placing it onto you as though you were the one who possessed these qualities all along. A parent who obsesses over their child's weight is frequently someone wrestling with their own body image and mortality. The friend who constantly brings up your failed relationship is often the one terrified of their own loneliness and romantic inadequacy. The colleague who aggressively points out your mistakes is typically someone drowning in self-doubt about their own competence, and by highlighting your flaws, they momentarily elevate themselves in their own psychological landscape. This mechanism operates because the human mind is fundamentally lazy, and when we experience uncomfortable truths about ourselves, truths that contradict our self-image or threaten our fragile sense of worth, we unconsciously redirect that discomfort outward like a spotlight sweeping across a dark room, landing on anyone within range. The person being projected upon becomes an unwilling repository for someone else's psychological waste. We have normalized this so thoroughly that entire relationships, families, and workplaces function as elaborate systems of mutual projection, where everyone is simultaneously depositing their unresolved issues into others while remaining completely unaware of their own participation in the process. The cruelest part is that projection often feels true to the projector, feels earned, feels like justified observation, when in reality it is merely biography masquerading as critique, making it nearly impossible to defend against because you are not actually being accused of your own failings, but rather someone else's. And how can you defend against an accusation that was never Ray? When you receive criticism from someone you respect, your immediate reaction is rarely measured or thoughtful, but rather a flood of defensiveness that reshapes how you perceive their words before you have even finished hearing them. In that moment, your brain has already decided whether you are right or wrong based entirely on how you feel about the person delivering the message, not on the merit of what they are actually saying, and this emotional filter becomes so powerful that you will argue against objectively valid points simply because accepting them would mean accepting that your initial emotional reaction was incorrect. The mechanism at work here is that emotions evolved as rapid decision-making tools designed to keep us safe in immediate physical danger. Yet we have transplanted this ancient system into complex modern situations where speed of judgment is precisely the opposite of what we need. When you feel embarrassed, threatened, or angry, your amygdala essentially hijacks your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for logic and nuance. And in that state, you cannot access the full range of information available to you because your emotional state is literally blocking the neural pathways required for comprehensive analysis. What makes this particularly cruel is that the people most prone to emotional decision-making are often completely unaware of it happening, convinced instead that they are thinking rationally while their emotions are doing the thinking for them. So they make career-altering decisions in fits of rage, end relationships over momentary conflicts that could have been resolved through patient conversation, and reject opportunities because they felt insulted rather than because the opportunities were genuinely bad. You wake up on a Tuesday morning and feel fine about your life until you open your phone and see that your college roommate just bought a house, your cousin landed a promotion you wanted, and an acquaintance from high school is vacationing in Bali. Within minutes, the contentment you felt has evaporated. The breakfast you were enjoying tastes the same, but now it feels ordinary. Your apartment, which you liked yesterday, suddenly feels small. Your job, which paid your bills reliably, now feels like a failure. Nothing about your actual circumstances changed, yet everything feels worse. This is the mechanism of comparison at work, and it operates with a peculiar cruelty that targets the most vulnerable parts of your psyche. When you measure your life against someone else's, you are not comparing equivalent datasets. You are comparing your complete internal reality, with all its struggles and complications and ordinary moments, against someone else's curated highlight reel, their best angles, their peak moments compressed into a single image or announcement. Your brain performs this calculation as if it were a fair contest, but it never is. The psychological mechanism behind this is rooted in something called relative deprivation, the idea that satisfaction depends not on absolute conditions, but on how your conditions stack against others around you. You could be living well by any objective standard, but if you perceive others as living better, your brain registers this as loss, as failure, as evidence that you are falling behind. This triggers the same neural pathways associated with actual deprivation, flooding your system with stress hormones and dissatisfaction despite no material change in your situation. What makes this particularly insidious is that comparison offers no benefit whatsoever. It does not motivate you toward genuine improvement. We live in a world that has constructed an elaborate mythology around intelligence, celebrating the quick mind, the fast talker, the person who arrives at answers before anyone else has finished formulating the question. Yet if you observe the actual outcomes of human life across decades and centuries, you will notice something profoundly counterintuitive. The patient person consistently outperforms the brilliant one. Consider the investor who waits years for the right opportunity, while the intelligent trader makes dozens of clever moves and ends up exhausted and broke. Or the writer who spends months perfecting a single manuscript, while the talented one churns out mediocre work monthly and fades into obscurity. Intelligence gives you the ability to see possibilities, to recognize patterns quickly, to solve problems in elegant ways. But patience is what actually allows you to execute those solutions, to weather the inevitable setbacks, to compound small advantages into massive ones over time. The patient person plants seeds knowing they will not harvest for years, and this fundamental acceptance of delayed gratification unlocks a different category of achievement entirely, one that intelligence alone cannot access. This paradox persists because we have designed our immediate environment to reward quick thinking. The classroom rewards the student with the fast answer, social media rewards the quick quip, business culture celebrates the rapid decision maker, yet none of these short-term validators translate to long-term success in any meaningful domain. The person with moderate intelligence and extraordinary patience will always eventually surpass the genius with no capacity to wait, because patience transforms intelligence into wisdom through application and time, while raw intelligence without patience becomes merely potential that evaporates into regret. When you first fail to do something you said you would do, you tell yourself a story about why it happened, and that story feels true in the moment because it usually contains a fragment of genuine difficulty wrapped in exaggeration and selective memory. Perhaps you skipped the gym and told yourself you were too tired, which was partly real, but you conveniently forgot that you had scrolled social media for 40 minutes before deciding sleep was more important. The excuse works, your mind accepts it, and you move forward feeling somewhat absolved of responsibility. But here is what happens next that most people never consciously observe. When the same situation arrives again, your brain does not start from zero. It has already been primed with an explanation that worked before, and it deploys that same excuse faster and with less scrutiny than it deployed the first one, because neural pathways are efficient and they prefer to retrace themselves. You skip the gym again, and this time you do not even pause to examine whether you are actually tired or whether you are simply reaching for a familiar justification that your mind has already approved. The excuse has become smoother, more automatic, less questioned. By the third or fourth repetition, the excuse is no longer something you actively construct. It is something that simply appears in your consciousness as if it were an objective fact about the world rather than a choice you are making. This is where the habit is truly born, not in the absence of effort, but in the automatization of rationalization. Your brain has learned that making excuses requires far less energy than actually confronting your own resistance or your own failure, so it begins to produce these excuses reflexively, the way your body produces saliva when you smell food. Two people can stand in a room together, genuinely caring for one another, their feelings authentic and deep, and still find themselves unable to build anything sustainable or meaningful from that connection, which seems impossible on the surface, but occurs with devastating regularity in human relationships. A couple might have chemistry, shared values, and real affection, yet discover they cannot communicate effectively, that their life goals diverge in fundamental ways, that one person's emotional needs far exceed what the other can provide, or that they simply lack the practical skills, maturity, or circumstantial alignment required to construct a functional partnership. Love becomes revealed as merely one ingredient among many others that are equally necessary but far less romantic, which means that passion alone cannot overcome financial incompatibility, cannot bridge the gap between someone who wants children and someone who does not, cannot force two people with opposing attachment styles to suddenly understand each other, and cannot substitute for honesty, consistency, commitment, and the willingness to do actual work. The psychological mechanism at play involves our cultural conditioning to believe that love is a force so powerful it can conquer all obstacles, that it is the primary currency of relationships, and that if two people simply care enough about each other, everything else will fall into place naturally, which romanticizes the reality that relationships require active problem-solving, emotional regulation, compromise, and often professional help. What makes this lesson particularly difficult to accept is that we have normalized the mythology through countless stories, songs, and films that suggest love's presence automatically guarantees success, while its absence guarantees failure, when in fact love's presence with everything else missing produces only heartbreak, and love's absence with everything else present at least. You wake up on a Monday morning convinced that this week will be different, that your boss will finally recognize your work, that your partner will understand what you need without you having to say it, that the gym membership you just purchased will transform your body by summer, that the new job will bring fulfillment, that the vacation will fix your relationship, that the inheritance will solve your financial stress. And somewhere in the depths of your mind, you have constructed an entire narrative about how things should unfold, and what people should do, and what outcomes should naturally follow from your efforts. When none of these things happen quite the way you imagined them, when your boss offers a lukewarm response to your presentation, when your partner remains oblivious, when your body changes slowly if at all, when the job feels mundane after 3 weeks, when the vacation includes arguments about money, when the inheritance disappears into taxes and obligations, you feel a crushing sense of failure and betrayal, even though nothing has technically gone wrong. The mechanism at work here is both simple and devastating. Your mind constructs a template of reality before reality has any chance to reveal itself. You invest emotional energy in this template. You treat it as though it is a contract with the universe. And when the universe inevitably follows its own logic rather than yours, you experience genuine pain. What makes this particularly insidious is that you rarely examine whether your expectations are reasonable or even desirable. You simply assume that the picture in your head represents how things ought to be, and then you blame external circumstances or other people for failing to meet obligations they never actually agreed to. There exists a peculiar phenomenon in human communication where the absence of words carries more weight than their presence, where the person who refuses to speak often holds more power in the room than the one who fills every void with sound and justification. Consider the workplace scenario where an employee makes a mistake and immediately launches into explanations, excuses, and defensive narratives, talking frantically to fill the uncomfortable silence that follows their failure, while their supervisor simply sits back and says nothing, allowing that quiet space to expand until it becomes unbearable, and the employee's own anxiety completes the punishment far more effectively than any words could have managed. The silence in that moment becomes an active force, a container that holds judgment, disappointment, and consequence without requiring articulation. This dynamic emerges from the fundamental truth that silence implies completeness and certainty, whereas speech often betrays uncertainty and the need for validation. And when someone remains quiet in response to your words or actions, your brain immediately fills that void with the worst possible interpretations, because the human mind abhors vacuum and rushes to construct meaning from emptiness. The person who speaks less becomes the person whose internal thoughts remain mysterious, and mystery itself creates power through the projection of others' fears and imaginations onto that blank canvas. We have normalized the equation that equates talkativeness with confidence and quiet with either wisdom or hostility, never quite certain which, and this ambiguity itself becomes the source of the silence's authority, for we can debate endlessly what the quiet person truly thinks while accepting their refusal to clarify as somehow more legitimate than our own desperate attempts at explanation. We are told from childhood that loyalty is a virtue to be given freely, that we should trust people automatically and prove our faith in them through unwavering support from the moment we meet them. Yet the universe operates on an entirely different principle than the one we have been taught. Loyalty in its authentic form is not a gift you distribute like candy at a parade. It is a currency that must be earned through consistent demonstration of trustworthiness, reliability, and alignment of values over an extended period of time. When you offer your loyalty to someone who has not yet proven themselves worthy of it, you are essentially handing them a weapon they can use against you, and statistics show that most people will use it. The mechanism behind this brutal truth is rooted in human nature itself. People reveal their true character gradually, through their choices when no one is watching, through how they treat those who cannot benefit them, and through their actions during moments of pressure or temptation. Someone can be charming and attentive in the early stages of any relationship, but charm is a performance that requires no investment, while true loyalty demands sacrifice, honesty during uncomfortable moments, and the willingness to prioritize another person's well-being even when it costs you something significant. What makes this lesson particularly difficult to accept is that we have normalized the practice of granting immediate trust and loyalty to people we barely know, treating it as a sign of emotional maturity and open-heartedness rather than recognizing it for what it truly is: a vulnerability that invites exploitation. We watch people repeatedly betray those who loved them blindly. We read stories of friends who disappeared when times got difficult. We witness family members who turned on each other when inheritance or advantage was at stake. And yet we continue to teach our children to give their trust away freely and too. You walk into a room full of people you've never met before, and suddenly the confidence you felt moments earlier begins to crack like ice under pressure. And this isn't because anything has actually changed about your abilities or knowledge, but rather because confidence exists in a fragile psychological state that is entirely dependent on context and the presence of witnesses to your performance. Which means the same person who felt completely assured, while alone in their car, can become hesitant and second-guessing the moment they must execute that same skill in front of an audience. The mechanism behind this is fundamentally about evaluation anxiety and the human brain's ancient survival programming that treats social judgment as a genuine threat to belonging and therefore to survival itself. So when stakes feel real and visibility increases, the prefrontal cortex, which handles rational thinking, partially surrenders control to the amygdala, which handles fear responses. And this creates a strange paradox, where you possess exactly the same competence you had before, but your nervous system no longer believes you do. What makes this particularly brutal is that this phenomenon persists despite the complete absence of logical justification. Because the audience members are typically not qualified judges, they are not keeping score in any meaningful way, and their attention will move to someone else within moments. Yet we continue to treat their temporary gaze as if it represents an existential evaluation of our worth and ability. Which is why we've normalized the practice of diminishing ourselves preemptively through self-deprecation and hedging statements that mysteriously seem to make audiences feel more comfortable even though they are objectively seeing us perform worse, because we have announced our own mediocrity before attempting the task. You lose someone, and for months or even years, you expect that the pain will fade until one day it simply disappears, leaving you whole and unbroken once more. But this is not how grief actually works. Instead, what happens is far more subtle and far more permanent. The acute agony dulls, the constant weight becomes less suffocating, and you learn to function again, but the grief itself remains dormant and waiting. Decades later, a song plays on the radio, or you catch a particular scent in the air, or you see someone with their parent or their child or their partner, and the loss returns with an intensity that surprises you with its immediacy, as though no time has passed at all. The reason for this is that grief is not a problem to be solved or a wound to be healed completely, but rather an integral part of how your brain processes attachment and loss. Every person you love becomes woven into your neural pathways, into your sense of how the world is supposed to work, into your expectations of what tomorrow will feel like. When they are gone, those pathways do not simply erase themselves. They remain, and whenever something activates them, the absence becomes suddenly, vividly real again. We have created an entire culture around the idea that you should get over it and move on and find closure, as though grief were a three-act story with a neat resolution at the end. But the truth is far lonelier and more honest. You do not move on from love, you only learn to carry it differently. The wound scars over, yes, but the scar remains visible and tender, and occasionally it aches in ways that remind you that something precious was taken from you, and that the person you loved was real, and that they mattered, and that their absence will always be a part of your story now. When you reach a certain level of achievement, something shifts in the way people relate to you, and you begin to exist in a different social dimension than those around you. The friends who knew you before your success start to feel uncomfortable in your presence because the gap between your circumstances and theirs has widened into something too vast to easily bridge, and they worry that you no longer understand their struggles or that you might judge them for not having climbed as high. Your former peers begin to treat you differently, either with subtle resentment masked as congratulations or with a false intimacy that feels hollow and calculated because they sense the power differential that success has created. Meanwhile, the people who are now drawn to you often want something, whether it is access, connection, opportunity, or the reflected status that comes from proximity to your achievement, and you can never quite trust whether they value you as a person or simply as a stepping stone to something they desire. This isolation intensifies because the specific challenges of your success are often ones that only other successful people truly understand, yet those people are typically your competitors, not your confidants. So you find yourself unable to fully discuss your real struggles without either seeming ungrateful or giving away strategic advantages. The mechanism driving this is fundamentally about envy and aspiration creating an invisible barrier, because success represents a crossing of a threshold that others have not yet crossed, and that difference makes ordinary connection feel impossible, as though you are speaking different languages or living in different worlds altogether. We have normalized this isolation as an acceptable price of achievement, treating it as simply the way things must be rather than recognizing it as a quiet loss that many successful people carry silently. And somehow we have decided that reaching the you have been wronged deeply and unmistakably, and someone has asked for your forgiveness, sometimes immediately, sometimes years later, and you have wanted so badly to simply grant it and move forward, to release the weight you have been carrying. Yet you find yourself unable to do so despite your genuine desire to heal and despite knowing rationally that holding on to resentment only poisons your own life and not theirs. The wound sits beneath your ribs like a stone, and though you understand intellectually that forgiveness is supposed to free you, you cannot seem to access it on command, no matter how many times you tell yourself that you should simply let it go and move on. This is because forgiveness is not a single decision made in a moment, but rather a process that unfolds across time, requiring your mind and body to gradually recalibrate their relationship to the memory, to the person, and to the hurt itself. The neural pathways that formed around your injury, the automatic defensive responses that arose to protect you from future similar wounds, the narrative you constructed about what this betrayal meant about you and about trust itself, all of these must slowly rewire themselves, and this rewiring cannot be rushed or forced without creating a false forgiveness that merely suppresses rather than resolves. Yet we live in a culture that treats forgiveness as though it should be instantaneous and complete, as though a sincere apology should immediately dissolve years of hurt, and we internalize tremendous shame when we discover that we are still angry, still hurt, still guarded around someone who has asked us to move past what they did. We judge ourselves for not being the kind and magnanimous person we imagine we should be, not recognizing that genuine forgiveness is one of the slowest and most demanding processes the human psyche undertakes, requiring repeated exposure to the memory without the protective armor, gradual exposure. Consider the person lying awake at 3 in the morning, replaying a conversation from earlier that day, imagining all the ways it could have gone wrong, constructing elaborate scenarios where their words are misinterpreted and relationships fracture as a result. Yet none of these mental simulations actually alter what was already said or done. They are spending hours of mental energy on a problem that exists only in their imagination, draining themselves of sleep and cognitive resources, and when morning arrives and they see the person again, nothing has changed except their own exhaustion. This is the essential nature of worry. It is a form of mental rehearsal that accomplishes nothing but creates the illusion of productivity while simultaneously deteriorating your physical and psychological state. The mechanism is deeply rooted in human survival instinct, a leftover from ancestral times when anticipating danger and mentally preparing for threats genuinely increased survival odds. Yet in our modern world where most threats are abstract and invisible and entirely beyond our control, this same mechanism becomes a torture device we inflict upon ourselves. We worry about job interviews that haven't happened, about illnesses we don't have, about judgments from people who barely think about us, about financial futures that depend on variables we cannot predict or influence, and we mistake this mental spiraling for caution or responsibility when it is actually just fear masquerading as preparation. The brutal truth is that worry has never prevented a single bad thing from occurring while simultaneously causing measurable damage to your cortisol levels, your sleep quality, your immune function, and your ability to think clearly when actual problems do arrive that require genuine problem solving. There exists a peculiar human tendency to believe that greatness emerges from occasional bursts of heroic effort, from those moments when we pour everything we have into a single task and emerge exhausted but transformed. And yet the actual architecture of human achievement tells a fundamentally different story, one that most people encounter repeatedly throughout their lives but struggle to internalize at a visceral level. Consider the person who decides on Monday morning that they will begin working out intensely every single day for 2 hours, full of motivation and conviction, only to find themselves completely burned out by Thursday, unable to even walk to their car without soreness and fatigue. Whereas the individual who commits to a simple 30-minute walk or light exercise every morning for years develops cardiovascular health, strength, mental clarity, and a body that functions optimally without the dramatic peaks and valleys of their more intense counterpart. The mechanism underlying this reality is rooted in how human physiology and psychology actually adapt to stimulus over time, rather than responding dramatically to single massive applications of effort. Because adaptation requires consistent signaling to the brain and body, repeated exposure that trains neurological pathways, builds muscle memory, creates metabolic changes, and establishes neural grooves that become easier to walk down with each repetition. Whereas the intense burst creates temporary adaptation, followed by the body essentially reverting to baseline once the stimulus disappears and the person recovers. Yet despite understanding this intellectually, despite having witnessed it play out in their own lives and in the lives of countless others, human beings continue to romanticize the notion of the intense effort, the dramatic transformation, the sudden leap forward, perhaps because we live in a culture that celebrates the visible, the momentary, the instant. Consider the person who has built a career on a particular expertise, who has spent decades perfecting their craft, who has earned accolades and respect within their field, and who then encounters a situation where they are fundamentally wrong about something essential to their work. In that moment, they face a choice between acknowledging the error and integrating this new understanding into their knowledge, or defending their previous position with increasingly elaborate justifications, reinterpreting evidence to fit their existing worldview, and isolating themselves from anyone who might challenge their established beliefs. The first path requires admitting that they were not as complete in their knowledge as they believed, that they might have made mistakes that affected others, that their reputation may need some adjustment, and that they are capable of being wrong despite all their experience and success. The second path feels safer, more protective, more aligned with the image they have cultivated of themselves over time, and it requires no difficult conversations or uncomfortable reassessments of their own competence. Pride operates as a defensive mechanism that calculates the social risk of admitting error as catastrophic, even though the actual consequence is rarely as severe as the mind imagines, and even though the refusal to grow creates far more damage over time. The psychological mechanism at work is a kind of identity fusion where a person has become so attached to their image of themselves as competent and knowledgeable that any contradiction feels like a personal attack rather than simply new information, and therefore the ego mounts a defense rather than the mind processing the input objectively. We have normalized this response by creating social hierarchies where admitting uncertainty is interpreted as weakness, where the appearance of consistency is valued more highly than the reality of continuous learning, and where there exists a peculiar phenomenon in human experience where individuals who have invested countless hours into mastering their craft, studying their field, building networks, and developing skills seem to encounter more fortunate breaks than those who have not. And what we casually call luck in these moments is almost entirely the collision between opportunity and readiness. When a musician who has practiced for 10,000 hours suddenly gets discovered at an open mic night, we call it serendipity. But the truth is that their refined ear, their stage presence, their ability to read an audience, and their network of other musicians created the conditions for that moment to be recognized as valuable rather than forgotten like 1,000 other performances by unprepared artists. The mechanism at work here is both practical and perceptual. A prepared person notices opportunities that an unprepared person walks past without recognition. Their trained mind catches the significance in conversations, sees the potential in connections, and possesses the knowledge to act decisively when a door opens. While simultaneously, the preparation itself creates a kind of gravitational pull that draws opportunities closer because prepared people tend to be in the right circles, engaging with the right conversations, and demonstrating competence that makes others want to involve them. Yet we persist in describing this as luck rather than acknowledging it as the inevitable result of effort and intentionality. Perhaps because admitting that preparation determines destiny strips away the romantic notion that anyone can win without doing the work. And we find comfort in believing that some people are simply blessed by forces beyond our control, rather than accepting that our outcomes largely reflect our investment in readiness and our willingness to put in the unglamorous hours that nobody celebrates. You begin something new with genuine excitement coursing through your veins, whether it is a fitness routine you have committed to, a creative project you have planned for months, or a professional goal you have written down and revisited countless times. For the first few days or weeks, you wake up energized by the prospect of working toward this thing, and the initial momentum carries you forward with remarkable ease. Every small win feels significant, every session feels purposeful, and you genuinely believe this time will be different from all the previous attempts that ultimately dissolved into nothing. But then something peculiar happens, something so consistent across human experience that it barely registers as noteworthy anymore. The motivation simply evaporates. Not because the goal became impossible, not because circumstances changed dramatically, but because the novelty wore off and your brain stopped flooding your system with dopamine for merely showing up. What remains is the actual work, the genuine discipline, the unglamorous repetition that must happen when the initial spark has been extinguished, and this is where most people discover they never actually had the commitment they thought they possessed. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon is relatively straightforward. Your nervous system is designed to reward novelty and punish routine, because from an evolutionary perspective, new activities warranted attention and energy investment, while familiar tasks could be executed more automatically. When you start something, your brain treats it as novel and releases motivational chemicals to keep you engaged, but as the activity becomes familiar, these chemical rewards diminish significantly. Your system is essentially saying that the learning phase has ended, and now you can operate on autopilot, except the problem is that most worthwhile pursuits require sustained effort long after the autopilot phase begins. Consider the person who wakes before dawn to train, long after the initial excitement of self-improvement has faded into routine monotony, long after the novelty has worn thin and the mirror shows only incremental changes that feel almost invisible to the naked eye. The desire that once burned bright, the vision of transformation, the hunger for something better, the emotional rush of commitment, this desire inevitably diminishes over weeks and months, yet the person still rises, still shows up, still performs the work. Discipline is what remains when desire has evaporated like morning dew under the sun's heat. It is the skeletal structure that continues to move the body forward after the soul has stopped cheering. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple. Desire is a feeling, and feelings are inherently unstable, fluctuating with sleep quality, hormone levels, recent failures, and the simple entropy of ordinary existence. Discipline, by contrast, is a decision made once and then embedded into habit, into identity, into the very architecture of how a person structures their days. It asks nothing of motivation because it does not depend on feeling at all. It depends only on the willingness to repeat an action regardless of emotional state. This is why the gym is filled with motivated people in January and nearly empty by March, yet the same 7 faces appear every single morning in April, May, June, and beyond. Those 7 people have transcended the realm of desire entirely and entered the realm of automatic function. They have become machines, yes, but machines that work. We rarely acknowledge this brutal truth about human nature, preferring instead to celebrate motivation and inspiration in our culture, flooding ourselves with quotes and stories about people who felt their way to success, when in reality the overwhelming majority of meaningful achievement belongs to those who simply stopped waiting for desire to return and When a person feels inadequate, threatened, or diminished in some fundamental way, they often respond not with vulnerability or honest self-reflection, but with cruelty directed outward toward others, and this pattern emerges so consistently across human behavior that it reveals something essential about how insecurity functions in the psyche. Consider the manager who publicly humiliates an employee, not because the employee deserves it, but because the manager fears being exposed as incompetent, so they reassert dominance through shame and belittlement. Consider the friend group that collectively ridicules someone for their appearance or interests, not because the target has done anything wrong, but because the group itself is struggling with collective anxiety and needs a designated weaker member to maintain hierarchy and belonging. The mechanism is deceptively simple. When we feel small, we attempt to make ourselves larger by making others smaller, and in that moment of inflicting pain, we experience a temporary relief from our own pain, a brief illusion of control and strength. This cruelty often targets the most vulnerable because vulnerable people pose no threat and offer the least resistance, making them perfect recipients for the displaced aggression of the insecure. What makes this pattern so persistent is that it works in the short term, which reinforces it. The insecure person achieves their goal of temporary relief, confirmation of superiority, and restoration of fragile self-image. So they repeat the behavior, and society often tolerates this cycle because we have built entire institutions around hierarchy and dominance that reward cruelty and mistake it for strength. We have normalized the idea that leadership means intimidation, that confidence means putting others down, and that power is most visible when wielded against the powerless. So cruelty becomes not just a symptom of insecurity, but a celebrated feature of success. There exists a peculiar paradox in human behavior where the pursuit of flawlessness becomes the very mechanism that stops us from moving forward, and this phenomenon plays out across nearly every domain of human endeavor, from creative work to personal relationships to professional development. Consider the person who wants to write a novel but spends years perfecting the opening chapter, never advancing to the middle or end because they cannot reconcile themselves to the imperfection they perceive on the page, or the entrepreneur who delays launching their business because market conditions are not yet ideal and their product lacks some feature they believe is essential. The perfectionist's mind constructs an invisible barrier between the present moment and progress, telling itself that the cost of imperfection is too high, that releasing something incomplete into the world is somehow a violation of standards, and this becomes the justification for paralysis. What drives this phenomenon is the psychological mechanism of risk aversion combined with a fundamentally misguided belief about how excellence is actually achieved, because the brain perceives the risk of failure or criticism as something to be eliminated entirely rather than something to be managed and learned from through iteration. The perfectionist erroneously believes that readiness comes before action, when in reality, action creates readiness, and the only genuine way to reach excellence is to move through the stages of imperfection with intention and adjust based on real-world feedback rather than imagined scenarios. Yet despite the obvious logical contradiction between standing still and progressing, despite the countless examples of successful people who launched imperfectly and improved along the way, we continue to normalize perfectionism as a virtue, praising those who are detail-oriented or conscientious without recognizing the shadow side where conscientiousness. There exists a profound paradox in human behavior where the act of exposing our deepest fears, failures, and uncertainties to another person requires more courage than almost any other endeavor we undertake, yet we spend most of our lives constructing elaborate defenses against it. When you stand before someone and admit that you are struggling, that you do not have all the answers, that you are afraid or uncertain or broken in some way, you are performing an act of genuine strength that modern culture has systematically taught us to interpret as weakness. The person who can admit to their partner that they need help, that they made a terrible mistake, that they are terrified of abandonment, that they do not know how to navigate their own mind, this person is displaying a fortitude that far exceeds the hollow bravado of someone who maintains an impenetrable facade. The mechanism behind this truth operates on a fundamental level within human connection and self-awareness. Vulnerability creates authentic intimacy because it removes the exhausting performance of invulnerability and allows another person to see and accept the whole of who you actually are rather than the edited version you present to the world. This authentic connection becomes the foundation of genuine relationships, trust, and psychological resilience because it is built on truth rather than illusion. The strength required to be vulnerable is the strength of self-honesty, the courage to be seen without armor, and the willingness to risk rejection in pursuit of real connection. Yet despite understanding this intellectually, despite knowing that every meaningful relationship in human history has been built on moments of vulnerability, we continue to treat it as something to be ashamed of or hidden away. When someone responds to a minor inconvenience with disproportionate rage, when a casual comment triggers an outburst that seems completely unrelated to what was actually said, when you find yourself furious at something that logically should not matter to you at all, you are witnessing the exposure of an old wound that has nothing to do with the present moment. Anger functions as a kind of emotional X-ray, illuminating injuries that have been buried beneath layers of daily routine and suppressed memory, wounds so familiar that we have learned to walk around them without acknowledging their presence. The person who snaps at their partner for forgetting to buy milk might actually be processing decades of feeling forgotten by their own parents, or they might be reacting to the specific way their partner dismissed their concern, which mirrors how they were always made small in their childhood home. The colleague who becomes aggressive during a minor criticism in a meeting might be protecting against the shame of old academic failures that were never properly grieved, or they might be defending against a deeper fear of inadequacy that has shadowed them since they were young. What makes this mechanism so reliable as a diagnostic tool is that our deepest wounds are the ones most likely to be triggered, because they are the ones most invested with unfinished emotional business, the ones still demanding resolution even though we have consciously moved on with our lives. When anger arises, it announces that something beneath the surface has been touched, and the intensity of the anger is often proportional to how raw or neglected that wound remains. Yet despite understanding this principle intellectually, we rarely pause in our moments of rage to investigate what has actually been activated, instead remaining focused on the surface trigger and the person we believe has wronged us, treating our anger as though it is always about the present and never. There is a peculiar tax that comes with building your own life, making your own decisions, and refusing to depend on others for validation or survival, and that tax is paid almost entirely in solitude. When you decide to walk your own path, you will find that the crowds naturally thin, that the invitations become fewer, that the casual friendships built on mutual compliance and comfortable agreement begin to fade like old photographs left in the sun. This is not because you have become less likable or somehow deficient in character, but rather because independence is fundamentally a lonely pursuit that requires you to stand apart from the groups and systems that provide comfort through conformity. The moment you stop seeking approval from your family structure, your peer group, or your professional hierarchy, you become difficult to predict, and people fear what they cannot predict. Independence means choosing your own values over inherited ones, and this choice automatically separates you from those who have not made it. Independence means accepting loneliness as the price of authenticity, because the people around you are often invested in you remaining as you were, remaining predictable, remaining part of the machine that keeps everyone comfortable. The psychological mechanism is straightforward. Humans are tribal creatures who gain their sense of self from the reflection of others, and when you stop needing that reflection, when you become self-directed and self-sufficient, you remove yourself from the tribal web. This is experienced as rejection by those still caught in it, even though you have rejected nothing but the demand for your compliance. We have normalized this arrangement by framing loneliness as a character flaw rather than as evidence of integrity, by suggesting that truly happy people are surrounded by crowds, when in truth the person building something real builds it often in silence, often in the company of tea. You wake up in a bed that millions of people would consider a luxury, in a home with running water and electricity, in a country where you are relatively safe. And yet within moments your mind has already begun cataloging what is wrong, what is missing, what you do not have, what did not go according to plan, and you move through your day in a state of mild to moderate dissatisfaction despite the objective abundance surrounding you. This is not a character flaw or a personal failing, but rather the natural operation of a neurological system that evolved to notice threats and problems rather than to celebrate stability and sufficiency. Because for most of human history, complacency about your circumstances could literally kill you. And so your brain learned to scan for danger and deficit with relentless efficiency while treating the absence of immediate danger as merely the baseline. The unremarkable default state that requires no emotional response or acknowledgement. Gratitude, by contrast, is the deliberate act of interrupting this automatic process, of pausing the threat detection system long enough to register what is actually functioning, what is actually present, what is actually working in your favor, and this does not happen naturally because it offers no survival advantage, and in fact runs counter to the vigilant, problem-focused mindset that kept your ancestors alive through countless threats and hardships. What makes this particularly brutal is that gratitude can be cultivated, but only through sustained, intentional repetition, the same way that any neural pathway becomes stronger through consistent use. And yet most people approach gratitude as something that should simply arise spontaneously whenever they consciously remind themselves to feel it, which rarely works because a single moment of remembering cannot overcome years or decades of habit. Of the brain's default setting to dismiss the ordinary and dwell on the excès. Consider the person who dreams of becoming a musician, yet realizes that mastering their craft demands thousands of hours of solitary practice, foregoing social gatherings, declining lucrative job offers in other fields, and accepting years of financial instability while their peers accumulate wealth and status. Consider the parent who sacrifices career ambitions, personal freedom, and spontaneous joy to raise their children with presence and care, knowing that every moment invested in their development is a moment removed from their own pursuits. Consider the athlete who wakes before dawn in darkness, endures physical pain that borders on agony, restricts their diet to measured portions of bland nutrition, and forgoes the simple pleasures of lazy weekends because they have committed to excellence in their chosen sport. The mechanism beneath these scenarios is fundamentally logical. Happiness rooted in genuine achievement or meaningful relationships requires sustained effort directed towards something outside immediate gratification, and this sustained effort necessarily means saying no to other things that provide comfort or pleasure in the present moment. Every choice contains an opportunity cost, and the pursuit of what truly matters demands that we sacrifice what merely entertains us. Yet what persists despite this clarity is our stubborn expectation that we should be able to have everything simultaneously, that fulfillment should arrive without trade-offs, that we might enjoy both the consequences of discipline and the comfort of indulgence. We have normalized the fantasy that happiness is something that happens to us rather than something we actively construct through deliberate sacrifice, and this delusion keeps us suspended between commitment and complacency, never fully willing to pay the price that genuine satisfaction demands, always resentful that life insists on making us choose. Consider the person who has spent 20 years in their profession, who has built a reputation, accumulated accolades, and established themselves as someone who knows what they are doing, and then a younger colleague or an entirely different field presents an idea that challenges their fundamental approach. Notice how the immediate response is often not curiosity, but defensiveness, not openness, but a subtle dismissal. The ego has constructed an identity around being competent, being right, being the expert, and any suggestion that there might be a better way, a different perspective, or a gap in knowledge feels like a direct threat to that carefully maintained sense of self. This is not stupidity or malice at work. It is the ego's survival mechanism kicking in, protecting the image we have invested decades in building. The mechanism operates like this. Our sense of self becomes entangled with our accomplishments and our expertise, so that learning something new is not merely acquiring information, it is admitting that our previous understanding was incomplete or flawed, which the ego interprets as personal failure. When we are young and unknown, learning feels safe because there is no established identity to protect. We can be wrong freely because wrongness is expected. But once we have claimed expertise, once we have written the book or made the decision or built the system, admitting that we did not know something feels like unraveling the entire structure of who we believe ourselves to be. What is remarkable is how we have normalized this defensive response, treating it as wisdom or principled conviction rather than recognizing it as fear. We celebrate people who are set in their ways and resistant to new ideas as strong-willed or traditional, when really they are simply protecting their ego at the expense of growth. There exists a peculiar human tendency to believe that complexity signals intelligence, depth, and sophistication, yet the most functional and enduring systems in nature and human civilization are almost invariably simple ones. Consider the person who explains their business strategy in 3 clear sentences versus the one who produces a 100-page document filled with jargon and nested frameworks, and you will observe that the simpler explanation creates better understanding and faster action. The complicated explanation makes the explainer feel important while leaving the listener confused, uncertain, and ultimately paralyzed in decision-making. We see this pattern everywhere. The most effective diets are simple calorie counting or basic portion control, not elaborate metabolic typing systems. The most durable relationships are built on simple honesty and consistency, not complex emotional games and strategic positioning. The most successful products are those that solve one problem elegantly, not those that attempt to do everything for everyone through labyrinthine feature sets. Yet we continue to add layers to complicate what works, to dress simple truths in unnecessary language, because we have internalized the false equivalence that complexity equals value. The psychological mechanism is straightforward. Complexity creates an illusion of control, of expertise, of having thought through something thoroughly, when in reality it often masks shallow thinking and fear of being understood too easily. A simple idea can be criticized, tested, and rejected quickly, but a complex one can hide behind its own obscurity for years, allowing the person invested in it to claim misunderstanding rather than accept failure. We normalize this through institutions that reward credentialism over results, through academic cultures that celebrate jargon, through business environments where simplicity feels like laziness rather than discipline. Consider the person who tells themselves they are being practical when they refuse to pursue their ambitions, who frames their paralysis as wisdom, who describes their hesitation as careful deliberation rather than what it actually is, pure fear wearing a business suit. Fear has an extraordinary talent for disguising itself as something respectable, something logical, something even noble, and this transformation happens so seamlessly that we rarely notice the switch. When you decline the opportunity because you tell yourself the timing is wrong, or the market is unpredictable, or you lack one more credential, what you are often really saying is that the fear of failure feels safer than the fear of trying, and your rational mind has simply agreed to help you avoid this by dressing up the fear in language that sounds sensible. This mechanism works because fear itself is not rational, so it can only survive in our modern consciousness if it borrows the clothes of reason. We have been taught to distrust our emotions, to prize logic above all else, and fear understands this perfectly, so it arrives at our doorstep speaking in the voice of pragmatism and caution. The person who says they cannot take the risk because they have responsibilities is often correct in the literal sense, and yet the intensity of their conviction, the way they defend this position with unusual passion, suggests that something deeper than logistics is at work. What makes this particularly insidious is that fear's disguise is so effective that we have built entire systems around it. We celebrate the careful planner and shame the risk-taker. We reward the person who says no and pity the person who tried and failed. Over time, we stop recognizing fear as the engine beneath our choices because we have normalized its costume so thoroughly that we actually believe the reasonable-sounding reasons we give ourselves. You can spend decades accumulating facts, reading books, earning degrees, and mastering the technical details of your field, only to find yourself making the same catastrophic mistakes as someone who never read a single page. And this gap between knowing something and understanding how to live with that knowledge is one of the most humbling discoveries you will ever make. A person can know every statistic about the dangers of poor sleep, understand the exact neurochemical processes that occur during rest, comprehend the long-term health consequences of insomnia, and yet still choose to stay awake scrolling through their phone at 3 in the morning, demonstrating that knowledge sits in the prefrontal cortex like an ornament on a shelf, while the limbic system, the older and more powerful part of your brain, continues to run the machinery of your actual behavior. The mechanism behind this disconnect is that knowledge is merely information that has been organized and stored, while wisdom is knowledge that has been integrated into your values, tested against your lived experience, and crystallized into genuine understanding that actually changes how you move through the world, which means you can intellectually know something with absolute certainty and still be completely incapable of acting on it when emotions, habits, or social pressure enter the equation. We have normalized this gap so thoroughly that we barely notice it anymore, building entire institutions around the transmission of knowledge, while assuming that knowledge will automatically lead to better choices, when in reality a person with genuine wisdom but minimal formal education will navigate life far more successfully than a highly educated person whose knowledge remains purely theoretical and disconnected from the actual practice of living. Which is why the smartest people in the room are sometimes the ones making the poorest decisions, constrained by the very framework of KN. When you decide to transform your life, you expect the transformation to match the intensity of your decision. You imagine that because you have finally committed to change, because you have finally seen the problem clearly and made the choice to fix it, the external world will reorganize itself accordingly and quickly. You quit smoking on a Monday and expect your lungs to feel pristine by Wednesday. You start exercising and believe your body will reshape within weeks. You begin a new career path and assume success will follow within months. You read the right book, attend the right seminar, have the right conversation, and suddenly you feel different, so you assume that difference will translate into immediate results. But change does not work this way. Change happens so gradually that you will often doubt whether it is happening at all. Your body requires months to rebuild muscle memory and years to fully repair from damage. Your mind requires weeks just to break a simple habit and months or years to rewire deeper patterns of thinking that took decades to establish. Your career requires seasons of consistent effort before any meaningful progress becomes visible to others. The brutal truth is that most meaningful change occurs beneath the surface, in increments so small that your conscious mind cannot detect them day to day. You will feel the same on Monday as you do on Tuesday. You will feel essentially unchanged for weeks or months, even though biological, psychological, and circumstantial shifts are genuinely occurring. This creates a powerful illusion that nothing is working, that you have failed, that your effort was in vain, when in fact the effort is accumulating silently. We have normalized the expectation of instant transformation because we live in an age of instant gratification where information arrives immediately and results are displayed in highlight reels. You remember that argument from 5 years ago with perfect clarity, replaying the exact words spoken, the tone of voice, the feeling in the room, but when you encounter the other person involved, they remember it completely differently, not just in interpretation, but in the actual sequence of events, and you both swear with absolute certainty that your version is the correct one. This is not a matter of one person lying and the other telling the truth. Both of you genuinely believe your recollection is accurate because your brain has reconstructed that memory thousands of times since it happened, and each reconstruction subtly changes it, filling in gaps with assumptions, coloring events with emotions that have developed since, and emphasizing details that align with your current self-image and beliefs about the situation. Your memory is not a video recording stored in a vault, but rather a story your mind tells and retells, and every time you recall something, you are not retrieving the original event, but retrieving the last time you remembered it, which may have been altered already. And then you alter it again in the present moment based on your current emotional state, your current beliefs, and what you need to believe about yourself in that moment. The brain fills in missing details automatically, creates false confidence in fabricated elements, and layers new emotional associations onto old events until the original experience becomes almost unrecognizable. Yet you experience this reconstructed version with the same vivid certainty as any direct perception, which is why eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable in courts of law, and why people in the same family can have completely opposing versions of their shared childhood. What makes this particularly difficult is that you cannot feel the distortion happening. The altered memory feels authentic and complete, which means you navigate through life making decisions, holding grud. When someone receives criticism, especially in front of others, or when it touches something they have invested themselves into, their response becomes a window into their actual character rather than the persona they present to the world. A person who immediately becomes defensive, who attacks the critic rather than considering the substance of what was said, who fabricates reasons why they could not possibly be wrong, reveals something fundamental about their relationship with truth and their own fragility. Conversely, someone who pauses, who asks clarifying questions, who acknowledges what has merit in the criticism, even while disagreeing with other parts, demonstrates a maturity and security that no amount of careful social performance could fake over time. The mechanism here is straightforward. Criticism activates our survival instincts in a way that normal social interaction does not, and when our ancient threat detection systems engage, we revert to our baseline patterns rather than our curated ones. We cannot fake grace under pressure indefinitely because pressure strips away the layers of conscious control we normally maintain. The person who responds to criticism with curiosity rather than hostility has genuinely cultivated that capacity, not merely performed it for the moment. Yet we have somehow normalized the opposite response, treating defensiveness as reasonable and investigation as weakness or admission of guilt. We tolerate and even expect people to double down when challenged, to surround themselves with those who will affirm them unconditionally, to dismiss critics as jealous or misunderstanding rather than considering whether the criticism contains any useful information. This normalization of defensive reactions persists because it requires less effort than genuine self-examination, and because in many social circles, the willingness to defend yourself aggressively is mistaken for strength. Consider the ancient parable of the reed and the oak tree standing side by side during a terrible storm, where the rigid oak with all its accumulated strength and density resists the wind with brute force until its trunk splinters and it crashes to the ground, while the slender reed bends and sways with the force of the gale, yielding to pressure rather than meeting it head-on, and when the storm passes, the reed remains standing unharmed and intact. This is not merely a metaphor but a principle written into the physical world and into human systems, yet we spend most of our lives building strength instead of cultivating flexibility. The mechanism is straightforward. When you are rigid and inflexible, you accumulate stress at your breaking point, and when an external force meets that immovable resistance, the structure fractures rather than adapts. But when you are flexible, you distribute stress across your entire being, You bend without breaking, you yield without surrendering, and you maintain your integrity through adaptation rather than through domination. The person who refuses to change their mind, their strategy, their career path, or their approach to relationships discovers that life has a way of forcing change upon them with tremendous pain, while the person who cultivates the ability to shift perspective, to try new methods, to move between roles and contexts, glides through obstacles that would destroy the rigid person. In nature, the strongest organisms are not those with the hardest shells, but those that can adapt most quickly to new environments. And in human civilization, the most successful individuals are rarely those who simply worked harder or believed more fervently in one unchanging vision, but rather those who remained sensitive to new information and willing to alter course when evidence suggested they should. Consider the trajectory of most celebrated figures throughout history and contemporary life, and you will notice a pattern so consistent it borders on inevitable. The person who commands the attention of millions one year becomes a footnote within a decade, their name barely registering in the cultural consciousness of those who once idolized them. A musician dominates the charts and seemingly owns the zeitgeist, their songs everywhere, their face inescapable, their influence apparently permanent, yet 5 years later they struggle to fill venues that once required tickets to be rationed. A social media personality accumulates millions of followers with a speed that feels exponential and irreversible, their every post generating thousands of interactions, their opinions shaping conversations, and then suddenly the algorithm changes or a younger competitor emerges, and the engagement plummets like a stone into dark water. The mechanism driving this phenomenon is rooted in human psychology and the way attention itself functions as a finite resource that must constantly be redirected toward novelty and stimulus. Our brains are not designed to maintain the same level of excitement about the same stimulus indefinitely. We adapt to it, we become desensitized, and we hunger for something fresh, something unexpected, something we have not yet fully processed. This is why the popular thing today becomes the invisible thing tomorrow, not because it was ever truly terrible or because its value genuinely evaporated, but because the human attention span operates on a cycle of discovery, saturation, and exhaustion that cannot be indefinitely disrupted. What persists despite this obvious truth is the desperate attempt by those who achieve popularity to somehow convince themselves that their moment can be preserved or extended through sheer force of will or strategic maneuvering, as if charisma and relevance were permanent properties rather than temper. You can be the most intelligent person in the room, possess extraordinary problem-solving abilities, demonstrate remarkable creativity, and possess a work ethic that rivals that of the most dedicated professionals. Yet if you walk in wearing wrinkled clothes, having neglected your grooming, or carrying yourself with poor posture, the initial assessment of your value has already been made before you've spoken a single word. The brutal truth is that appearance functions as a powerful currency in human society, one that often outweighs competence in the critical first moments of interaction, in job interviews, in romantic encounters, and in the everyday judgments we make about who deserves our attention and respect. People make snap decisions about your intelligence, your reliability, your trustworthiness, and your worthiness based almost entirely on visual information, and these initial impressions calcify quickly into lasting beliefs that are extraordinarily difficult to overturn. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon operates on several interconnected levels. Our brains are wired to process visual information faster than any other form of input, and we use appearance as a shortcut to categorize people and predict their behavior, a mental efficiency that served survival purposes in ancestral environments but now operates as a systematic bias in modern contexts. Additionally, appearance has become culturally coded with meaning, where certain styles, grooming choices, and body types have been assigned associations with competence, wealth, morality, and social status. And these associations are so deeply embedded in our cultural narratives that they function like invisible rules that everyone follows without question. We have normalized the notion that how you look reflects who you are, creating a self-reinforcing system where people who meet conventional standards of attractiveness and grooming receive preferential treatment, W. When the human mind lacks stimulation, purposeful challenge, or genuine engagement, it does not simply rest in a state of peaceful emptiness, but rather begins to turn inward and sideways, seeking friction and intensity through whatever means become available, often destructive ones. Consider the teenager with no structured activity, no compelling interest, and no meaningful work before them, who finds themselves scrolling through social media for hours, or engaging in petty theft, or deliberately antagonizing peers until a physical confrontation erupts, or experimenting with substances that fundamentally alter their chemistry. Consider the office worker trapped in a role that demands their presence but not their actual thought, spending the day refreshing emails that do not matter, watching the clock as if it were a living thing, and returning home so depleted by the monotony that they collapse into numbing behaviors. Consider the individual on long-term unemployment who feels their days bleed together without purpose, and how small acts of destruction, breaking something, starting conflict, creating chaos through their own choices, suddenly produce a sensation of consequence, of mattering, of being alive in a way that waiting passively does not provide. The mechanism at work here is that boredom is not a comfortable state, but rather a state of profound psychological deprivation, where the brain lacks the stimulation required for its natural reward systems to function. The human nervous system evolved to seek challenge, to solve problems, to engage in meaningful action, and when that engagement is absent, the system begins to malfunction. Destruction provides stimulation instantly. It provides immediate consequence. It provides proof of impact. And so the bored mind gravitates toward it not through some moral failing, but through a genuine neurological hunger that goes unsatisfied by the emptiness that surrounds it. Consider the moment when you first attempt something genuinely new, something that sits just beyond the edge of your current capability, and notice the immediate resistance that rises within you. Your muscles tense, your mind generates elaborate reasons why this particular moment is not optimal, why waiting would be wiser, why the comfort of your existing skill set is actually quite sufficient for your current needs. This sensation of resistance, this visceral pull toward the familiar, is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is precisely the signature of genuine growth beginning to occur. The discomfort you feel when learning a new skill, when confronting a difficult conversation, when pushing your body beyond its established limits, or when admitting you were wrong about something important is not an obstacle to overcome on your way to growth. The discomfort is the actual mechanism through which growth happens. Your nervous system interprets unfamiliar territory as threat, which is why anxiety accompanies learning. Your muscles burn when they are being forced to adapt to new demands, which is why soreness follows growth. Your ego resists correction and vulnerability, which is why shame or embarrassment often precedes genuine change in perspective. This biological and psychological reality operates according to a logic that is difficult to escape. Tissue must be stressed to strengthen, minds must encounter resistance to expand, and character must be tested to develop resilience. Yet despite understanding this intellectually, most people spend their entire lives choosing the familiar over the uncomfortable, and then they wonder why they feel stagnant, unchallenged, and unfulfilled. We have constructed entire lives of convenience that insulate us from productive discomfort, while simultaneously consuming content that celebrates transformation. Then we express confusion about why transformation never actually arrives. You spend years, sometimes decades, making decisions with incomplete information and muddled reasoning, operating from assumptions you never questioned and beliefs inherited from people who were themselves confused. You choose a career path without understanding what the work actually feels like day after day. You enter relationships without recognizing the patterns you carry forward from childhood. You build habits and routines based on what seemed important at the time, and only much later, sometimes only near the end, does the picture become clear. The clarity arrives like an unwelcome visitor after the house has already been decorated according to an old blueprint, and by then the walls are load-bearing, the foundation is set, and the cost of reconstruction feels impossibly high. This pattern repeats across nearly every significant domain of human life, and yet we continue to act as though we understand things in the moment when we demonstrably do not. The mechanism behind this delay is straightforward enough. Real understanding requires experience, and experience requires time, and time is precisely what we lack when we are forced to make our largest decisions. A 20-year-old choosing a profession cannot possibly know what 40 years of that work will extract from their soul. A person entering their first serious relationship cannot comprehend the specific nature of their own neediness and defensiveness until they have lived through the collision of their patterns with another person's patterns repeatedly. We are essentially making permanent decisions while operating with the clarity of a person in a dark room, holding only a flashlight that illuminates perhaps 10 feet ahead. The psychological framework that perpetuates this cruel timing is our desperate need to move forward, to commit, to reduce uncertainty by making choices, even when those choices rest on foundations of sand. You stand at the threshold of something you want to do, something that matters, and instead of moving forward, your mind spirals into infinite loops of analysis and contingency planning. You imagine every possible outcome, every mistake you might make, every way things could go wrong, and in doing so, you construct a mental prison so elaborate that moving becomes nearly impossible. The decision that should take minutes stretches into hours, days, or weeks as you compile endless lists of pros and cons, research every available option, and seek validation from others who are equally paralyzed by their own uncertainty. Meanwhile, the window of opportunity gradually closes, and by the time you finally decide to act, circumstances have changed or the moment has simply passed. This is the architecture of overthinking, the belief that perfect information and complete certainty are prerequisites to action, when in reality they are luxuries that rarely exist. The psychological mechanism underlying this paralysis is deceptively simple. Your brain mistakes analysis for progress, treating thought as a substitute for doing. When you think about something, your mind releases small amounts of the same neurochemicals associated with actually accomplishing it, creating a false sense of productivity and achievement. This reward loop keeps you thinking rather than acting because thinking feels safer and requires less vulnerability than genuine action, which always carries the risk of failure or exposure. You convince yourself that one more analysis, one more consideration, one more perspective will unlock the perfect solution, when the truth is that most important lessons only emerge through the actual experience of doing something imperfectly. What persists despite its obvious illogic is the cultural normalization of overthinking as a sign of intelligence or conscientiousness. Imagine a coworker receives credit for your idea in a meeting, and you say nothing in the moment, telling yourself it does not matter, that you will let it go, that bringing it up would make you look petty or difficult. Days pass and you find yourself replaying the moment, each time your internal narrative grows sharper and more detailed, each time the slight feels larger than before, and you begin to notice other small slights you had forgotten or minimized, until suddenly this person's entire existence in your workplace feels like an affront to your dignity. You stop responding warmly to their messages, you decline their lunch invitations, you contribute less enthusiastically in meetings where they speak, and all of this happens beneath the surface, invisibly, a slow accumulation of withdrawal and coldness that others sense but cannot quite name. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple yet profoundly destructive. Resentment grows not in moments of acute pain, but in the spaces between, in the moments when we choose silence over honesty, when we convince ourselves that our hurt feelings are too small or too inconvenient to address directly. Each time we swallow our words, each time we tell ourselves that it will blow over, we are actually embedding the wound deeper into our consciousness. Because unspoken frustration does not fade, it ferments, it transforms into a toxic narrative that we rehearse endlessly in our minds until fiction becomes indistinguishable from fact. What makes this particularly insidious is how invisible it remains to everyone except ourselves, how we can nurture resentment while maintaining perfect composure on the surface, how we have been taught that holding onto hurt quietly is somehow noble or mature, when in truth it is simply slow damage that we inflict upon ourselves, slowly poisoning our own capacity for connection, joy, and peace. In a world that constantly celebrates achievement and visibility, humility operates as an invisible force that rarely receives recognition or reward, and this systematic overlooking of humble behavior has become so normalized that we barely notice it happening around us. When someone quietly solves a problem without announcing it, when someone admits a mistake without making excuses, when someone steps back to let others take credit, these acts go largely unnoticed because humility is inherently anti-promotional. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention, and it certainly does not build the kind of personal brand that social media algorithms reward and amplify. The mechanism here is straightforward. Our attention naturally gravitates toward noise and self-promotion, toward the person in the room speaking loudest, toward the individual taking credit and celebrating themselves publicly, because visibility creates the illusion of importance and competence, and we have evolved to notice what stands out rather than what quietly works in the background. Meanwhile, the truly humble person or leader continues their work without fanfare, fixing things that were broken, mentoring others without expecting recognition, doing the unglamorous work that actually moves things forward. Yet they receive a fraction of the attention and opportunity that goes to their more self-promotional counterparts. What makes this particularly brutal is that humility is often more correlated with actual competence and good judgment than arrogance, is because humble people tend to listen more, learn continuously, admit what they do not know, and therefore adapt faster to reality. Yet these same people frequently get passed over for promotions, partnerships, and visible success because they do not make a case for themselves as loudly as others do. You tell yourself you intend to change, to be better, to pursue something meaningful, and in that moment of declaration, you feel the weight lift from your shoulders as though you have already accomplished the thing you claim to desire. A person promises their partner they intend to be more present, more attentive, more loving, and they feel virtuous for having made this declaration. Yet weeks later, they remain precisely as distant and distracted as before, wondering why nothing has shifted despite their stated commitment. A professional resolves they intend to finally start that project, to learn that skill, to build that business. And the intention itself provides such a dopamine rush that the urgency to actually take steps dissolves almost immediately into the comfort of imagining the eventual outcome. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple. Our brains reward us neurologically for stating intentions just as powerfully as they would reward us for achieving results, which means we have inadvertently learned to satisfy our ambitions through mere declaration rather than through the difficult work of execution. We have normalized this substitution so completely that we rarely notice it happening, speaking of our intentions as though they carry the same moral weight as our actions, as though saying we intend something obligates the world to recognize our goodwill even as we fail to follow through. The cruel truth is that the world does not evaluate you based on what you meant to do or what you intended to accomplish, but only on what actually materialized in the real world, and no amount of sincere intention can alter this fundamental reality of existence. Your partner does not feel loved by your intention to be present. They feel the absence of your actual attention. You spend your entire day making decisions that aren't actually yours, performing versions of yourself that don't authentically exist, and rearranging your priorities based on the imagined judgments of people who barely think about you at all. You choose your words carefully in conversations, filtering out the parts of your thoughts that might provoke disagreement or discomfort, and you find yourself laughing a little too loudly at jokes that aren't particularly funny because the person telling them matters to your social standing. You wear clothes that match someone else's aesthetic preferences, you nod along to opinions you don't share, and you take jobs that feel meaningless because they carry prestige in circles where you desperately want to belong. The mechanism that drives this is remarkably simple. Your brain evolved in small tribal groups where social rejection literally meant death, where being cast out from the group was a genuine survival threat. That ancient wiring still fires today, creating the same desperate urgency around approval that once protected your ancestors, except now it's protecting you from nothing except the discomfort of being authentically yourself. Yet despite understanding this mechanism consciously, despite knowing that most people are too preoccupied with their own insecurities to genuinely care about your choices, you continue performing anyway. You've normalized the idea that your value fluctuates based on external validation, that your decisions should be vetted through the lens of what others might think, and that gaining approval from people who don't truly know you is somehow a reasonable use of your limited time. The trap tightens because seeking approval is infinitely unsatisfying. There is always another person to impress, another standard to meet, another layer of performance required. Most people move through their entire lives operating under fundamental misunderstandings about who they are, what drives them, and why they make the choices they make. And this gap between self-perception and reality is so profound that genuine self-awareness has become something almost exotic in the human experience. We meet countless individuals who are convinced they are rational actors making deliberate decisions based on careful consideration, when in truth they are being steered by unconscious patterns, inherited family dynamics, unexamined fears, and desires they have never bothered to identify or name. A person might genuinely believe they are kind while being oblivious to the ways their kindness serves primarily to make themselves feel superior. Or they might think themselves ambitious while remaining completely blind to how their ambition is actually rooted in deep insecurity and a hunger for external validation. The mechanism behind this widespread blindness is partly neurological and partly psychological, because our brains are fundamentally designed to protect our self-image rather than to reveal uncomfortable truths about ourselves, and we possess an almost infinite capacity to rationalize our behavior in ways that make us feel acceptable in our own minds. We rewrite our histories, reinterpret our motivations, and selectively remember events in ways that support a flattering narrative about ourselves, and this happens largely outside our conscious awareness, making it almost impossible to catch ourselves in the act. What makes this particularly brutal is that self-awareness requires a kind of courage and discomfort that most people spend their entire lives actively avoiding. Because once you truly see yourself clearly, you can no longer pretend that your suffering is entirely circumstantial or that your failures are entirely the fault of others or bad luck. And this responsibility is so heavy that most people choose blindly. Consider the person who wakes at the same time each morning, who follows the same sequence of movements, who eats at predictable hours and works within defined boundaries, and you might assume they are trapped within the confines of their own design, yet the opposite proves consistently true across human experience. The routine becomes the container that holds chaos at bay, the framework that prevents decision fatigue from consuming the mental resources required for actual meaningful choice. And what emerges from this structure is not imprisonment, but rather a kind of liberation that only becomes visible once you understand the mechanism at work. When your body knows when to sleep and wake, when your mind does not need to deliberate about whether you will exercise or eat well, because these are simply scheduled elements of the day rather than choices to be made, you preserve an enormous quantity of cognitive energy that can then be directed toward the pursuits that actually matter, toward the ambitions that require genuine creative thought, toward the relationships that demand your full attention and intention. The person without routine spends their days in a state of constant negotiation with themselves, burning through willpower deciding what to do next, fighting inertia, making the same small decisions repeatedly until the day dissolves and they have accomplished nothing, while simultaneously feeling exhausted by the weight of infinite possibility. This paradox reveals something fundamental about human psychology that we rarely acknowledge openly. Constraints do not diminish freedom, but rather enable it by creating the stable foundation upon which meaningful choices can be constructed, and yet we continue to chase the fantasy of a life without structure, believing that limitations are obstacles to be overcome rather than the very architecture of functional existence. There exists a peculiar social phenomenon where the person in the room who speaks in cautious, doubt-laden tones about future outcomes is often perceived as more intelligent, more realistic, and more grounded than the person who expresses optimism or confidence about what might be achieved. When a pessimist speaks, they layer their words with qualifications and caveats, acknowledging all the ways something could fail, all the obstacles that might arise, all the historical precedents of similar ventures collapsing under their own weight, and this catalog of potential disasters somehow registers in the listener's mind as evidence of superior thinking, of a person who has done their homework, who understands complexity, who refuses to be fooled by simple narratives. The optimist, by contrast, often gets labeled as naive or inexperienced, as someone who has not yet learned how the world truly works, even when both people possess identical information and identical stakes in the outcome. This happens because pessimism requires only the ability to list problems, and problems are everywhere, abundant and obvious once you start looking for them, whereas optimism requires you to articulate not just why something might work, but also to maintain that position despite acknowledging the very real difficulties that the pessimist has already enumerated. There is an intellectual elegance to the pessimistic posture that makes it feel safer to adopt, because if you predict failure and failure comes, you appear wise. And if failure does not come, you can simply say you are pleasantly surprised, whereas the optimist lives in constant vulnerability, forced to defend their position against every emerging headwind. We have constructed a cultural framework where intelligence and skepticism have become almost synonymous, where the willingness to poke holes feels like evidence of depth, and somewhere in this framework we have made it socially rewarding to be. When you observe people who consistently achieve their goals across different domains, you notice something peculiar about their relationship with uncertainty and failure. The optimist approaches a difficult project, a new business venture, or a challenging social situation with an expectation that things will work out. And this expectation doesn't merely make them feel better in the moment. It fundamentally alters their behavior in ways that create actual tangible results. They attempt more things because they believe more things are possible, and attempting more things means they encounter more opportunities for success, which means statistically they win more often than the pessimist who never attempts at all. The mechanism is brutally simple. Optimism creates action, and action creates outcomes, whereas pessimism creates paralysis, and paralysis creates nothing. The pessimist accurately calculates all the ways something could fail and concludes it is not worth trying, while the optimist acknowledges those same potential failures but decides the possibility of success is worth the risk, so they move forward with energy and persistence that the pessimist simply does not generate. Over time, this compounds into a gap so wide that it appears the optimist was lucky, when in fact they were simply more willing to move through uncertainty. What makes this phenomenon persist despite its logical transparency is that we have been trained to mistake caution for wisdom, to confuse risk assessment with strategic thinking, and to interpret pessimism as realism rather than as a form of learned helplessness. We tell ourselves the optimist is naive while the pessimist is grounded, but the evidence suggests the opposite. The optimist understands that the world responds to action and belief, while the pessimist mistakes their own fear for objective truth. You sit in a quiet room and think back to summers when you were 12 years old, and in that moment of recollection, you feel a profound sense of warmth and simplicity that seems almost tangible, as if you could reach back through time and touch that golden period of your life. You remember the endless afternoons, the friends who felt like they would always be there, the freedom from responsibility, the way the world seemed infinite and full of possibility. Yet if you were to honestly examine what was actually happening during those summers, you would discover that you were often bored, occasionally anxious, sometimes lonely, frequently in conflict with your family, and wrestling with insecurities about your appearance and social status. The human brain does not store memories like a video camera preserves footage. Instead, it reconstructs memories each time you recall them, and with each reconstruction, the emotional tone shifts, the difficult moments fade, the minor joys expand, and the overall narrative becomes increasingly distorted toward either tragedy or paradise. Nostalgia operates as a cognitive filter that removes context and difficulty while amplifying the feelings associated with specific moments, creating a false equivalence between how a time actually felt moment to moment and how it feels when you compress it into a few emotionally resonant highlights. This mechanism exists because your brain is fundamentally designed to extract meaning and maintain emotional equilibrium rather than to preserve accurate records. And so when you access old memories, your present emotional state, your current dissatisfactions, your needs in this moment all reshape what you retrieve from the past. The cruelest aspect of nostalgia's dishonesty is that you often use these falsified memories to torment yourself in the present, believing that you have lost something genuine when in reality you have only lost your current access to a distorted. There exists a peculiar paradox in human behavior where the desire to save time in the present moment creates exponentially greater costs in the future, yet we repeat this pattern with remarkable consistency throughout our lives. When you take a shortcut to avoid the proper process, you are not actually saving time at all. You are merely shifting the debt forward to a moment when you will be forced to pay interest on it. Consider the student who copies homework instead of learning the material, the professional who submits work without proofreading, the person who avoids maintenance on their car, or the friend who never addresses a conflict directly and instead lets resentment fester into a damaged relationship. In each instance, the shortcut feels efficient in the moment because the immediate burden is reduced, but the true cost accumulates silently in the background. The mechanism behind this is rooted in how our brains are wired to prioritize immediate relief over distant consequences. The discomfort of doing something properly is present and real, while the cost of cutting corners exists in a future that feels abstract and far away. We are neurologically primed to discount future pain in favor of present comfort, and this evolutionary survival instinct, which once helped us make quick decisions in dangerous situations, now works against us in a world where careful planning matters. What makes this particularly insidious is that the real price of shortcuts is often hidden or delayed so effectively that we never directly connect our current crisis to the shortcut we took months or years earlier. When the bill finally comes due, we blame circumstance, bad luck, or external factors rather than recognizing our own role in creating the problem through that small decision to cut corners. There exists a peculiar moment in human interaction when the wells of compassion run dry, when the capacity to feel what another person feels simply ceases to function, not because you are cruel or indifferent by nature, but because you have exhausted the finite resources of emotional energy available to you on any given day. You encounter someone in genuine distress, someone whose suffering is real and deserves acknowledgement, yet you find yourself unable to muster the internal response that empathy demands, and you recognize in that moment that empathy is not an infinite well, but rather a reservoir that depletes with use. The psychological mechanism at work here is straightforward. Empathy requires cognitive and emotional labor. It demands that you temporarily inhabit another person's perspective, that you suppress your own immediate concerns and priorities to make space for theirs. And this process exhausts something real within you, something measurable in terms of attention span, emotional bandwidth, and psychological resources. When you have spent the day absorbing the problems of colleagues, friends, family members, or even strangers, when you have given your empathic attention generously and repeatedly, the tank empties, and what remains is a person who cannot authentically care because the machinery required for caring has temporarily shut down. We rarely discuss this limitation openly because it contradicts the moral narrative we have constructed around empathy as an unqualified good, a virtue without ceiling or boundary, something we should always be willing to extend regardless of cost to ourselves. Yet the truth persists beneath this fiction. You cannot care equally about everything, you cannot maintain deep empathic connection with every person who makes a claim upon your attention, and attempting to do so leads not to greater compassion, but to burnout, resentment, and a hollowed-out version of empathy that becomes performative. Every decision you make today is infinitesimal on its own, so small that you cannot possibly feel its weight or significance in the moment. Yet when you string 10,000 of these decisions together across months and years, they reshape the entire architecture of your life in ways that feel inevitable in retrospect. The choice to skip the gym today costs you nothing tangible, and so you make it freely, but that same choice made tomorrow and the day after that, and the day after that begins to accumulate interest like a debt you never knew you were accruing. And suddenly you find yourself 5 years removed from your decision-making self, standing in a body you do not recognize, wondering how you arrived at this destination when you never consciously chose to go there. The mechanism is brutally simple and operates beneath conscious awareness most of the time. Each choice triggers a cascade of neurological reinforcement that makes the identical choice easier to make the next time, and this ease itself becomes a kind of invisible gravity that pulls you toward repetition, toward the path of least resistance, toward the version of yourself that emerges not from grand declarations, but from the accumulated weight of 1,000 small surrenders. We rarely speak of this compounding effect because we prefer to believe in our capacity for sudden transformation, in the romantic notion that we can change ourselves through willpower and revelation rather than through the grinding, unglamorous reality of daily repetition. Yet this preference for dramatic change blinds us to the truth that you are not the same person who woke up yesterday, and you will not be the same person who wakes tomorrow, because the person you are is a function of the choices you make today. And those choices have already begun their work, whether you are paying attention or not. Consider two identical actions separated only by circumstance, and watch how the same behavior transforms entirely in meaning depending on what surrounds it. A man standing outside a woman's window at midnight could be a romantic gesture worthy of celebration in one cultural moment or a criminal act warranting police intervention in another. A person refusing to shake hands might be seen as disrespectful arrogance in one context, or as a reasonable boundary rooted in health consciousness or cultural practice in another. The action itself remains physically unchanged, yet context rewrites its entire moral and social valence so thoroughly that we struggle to recognize them as the same phenomenon at all. This principle extends into how we judge character, competence, and intention across nearly every domain of human interaction. A nervous person in a job interview appears anxious and unprepared, but the same nervous energy in an athlete before competition signals passionate commitment and mental sharpness. Wealth accumulated through inheritance feels lucky and blessed, but identical wealth accumulated through aggressive business tactics feels ruthless and morally compromised. The brutal truth is that context is often invisible to us, and we fail to recognize that we are constantly judging identical phenomena through wildly different lenses based on information we barely notice we possess. We apply this inconsistently throughout our lives, sometimes extending grace and understanding when we know someone's full story, then withdrawing it instantly when presented with a decontextualized moment from their life. This creates a world where the same person can be simultaneously victim and villain, depending entirely on which portion of their story the observer has access to. Understanding this completely reshapes how we should approach judgment, empathy, and the stories we tell ourselves about other people. When you observe the world with genuine attention, you begin to notice that suffering is not distributed according to merit or intelligence or moral character, but rather it is woven into the fabric of existence itself, touching the wealthy and the poor, the celebrated and the forgotten, the young and the old with an impartiality that defies any attempt to escape it through circumstance or achievement. The executive in the corner office experiences anxiety about maintaining status, the laborer experiences the pain of exhaustion, the artist experiences the torment of self-doubt, and the parent experiences the weight of responsibility. And none of these forms of suffering are lesser or greater in their fundamental reality to the person enduring them. We construct elaborate narratives about how certain life paths will deliver us from suffering, believing that if we acquire enough money or recognition or love or security, we will somehow transcend the basic condition of being human. And yet we observe repeatedly that these acquisitions merely shift the nature of suffering without eliminating it. The mechanism underlying this universality is simple yet profound. Consciousness itself contains the seeds of suffering because awareness means recognizing impermanence, limitation, loss, and mortality, and no material circumstance can insulate you from these truths. What persists most strikingly despite this obvious reality is our stubborn collective denial of it, the way we continue to believe that suffering is something that happens to other people, to those who made mistakes or lack discipline or simply have bad luck, rather than accepting that it is the default human condition from which no amount of optimization provides permanent escape. We have normalized the pursuit of comfort and advantage as though these pursuits represent actual solutions rather than temporary palliatives, and we judge those who suffer more visibly as though they have failed. There is a peculiar asymmetry in human psychology that most people never consciously recognize, yet experience repeatedly throughout their lives, and it concerns the relative speed at which we can intellectually understand something versus the much longer duration required for us to genuinely accept it. You can learn in a single moment that a relationship is over, that a job opportunity will not materialize, that your body will not perform as it once did, or that a dream you have carried for decades will never be realized. Yet the actual acceptance of these truths unfolds across weeks, months, or even years in ways that feel simultaneously obvious and mysterious. The intellectual acknowledgement is swift and efficient, a simple transaction where information enters your mind and you can state the facts clearly to yourself or others. But acceptance is something entirely different, something that requires the slow recalibration of your entire emotional landscape, your daily habits, your identity, and your sense of possibility. Consider how long it takes someone to truly accept that they are no longer young, or that they will not achieve the level of success they once imagined, or that they have disappointed someone they love irreparably. The brain can process these facts immediately, yet the heart, the instinctive reactions, the automatic patterns of hope and anticipation continue firing long after the mind has registered the truth. This delay persists despite having no logical justification whatsoever because acceptance is not primarily a cognitive function, but rather an emotional integration, a process that requires your entire being to reorganize itself around a new reality, and this reorganization cannot be rushed or forced through willpower alone. When something goes wrong in your life, there exists a peculiar comfort in directing your anger and disappointment outward rather than inward, and this mechanism is so rewarding that it becomes your default response before you even realize what is happening. You miss a deadline at work, and rather than acknowledge that you procrastinated and mismanaged your time, you blame your boss for setting unrealistic expectations or your coworkers for not helping enough. And in that moment of externalized blame, your nervous system relaxes slightly because you have transferred the weight of failure from your shoulders to someone else's. A relationship ends badly, and instead of examining your own patterns of communication or emotional unavailability, you convince yourself that your partner was fundamentally incompatible with you or was dishonest from the beginning. And this narrative feels so much better than the harder truth that you contributed to the deterioration, in ways you could have controlled. The psychological mechanism behind this is straightforward and rooted in our need to protect our self-image and maintain a stable sense of identity. Because admitting fault requires you to integrate negative information about yourself into your self-concept, which creates cognitive dissonance that is actively painful to sit with. Blame short-circuits this pain by allowing you to remain the protagonist of a story in which you are fundamentally okay and the world around you is the problem. And this feels good in the immediate moment because you get the relief of anger without the vulnerability of responsibility. What makes this particularly insidious is that blame often contains just enough truth to feel justified, because rarely is any situation entirely one person's fault, and so you can point to the legitimate ways others contributed while conveniently ignoring your own role, creating a narrative that feels both accurate and comforting. There exists a peculiar phenomenon in human psychology where the moment something becomes yours, the burden of it intensifies in ways that seem entirely disconnected from the object itself. You spend months dreaming of owning a house, imagining the freedom and pride it will bring, only to find that the day you close on the mortgage, a subtle weight settles into your chest that never quite lifts. The same structure you fantasized about now feels like an anchor, because every crack in the foundation becomes your responsibility, every repair bill is your problem, and every decision about its future rests entirely on your shoulders. Before ownership, you could walk away from a problem with relative ease, but afterward, you're bound to it in a way that transforms casual concern into active dread. This extends far beyond real estate. You finally purchase that car you've been saving for, imagining the autonomy it represents, but suddenly you're hyper-aware of every unusual sound the engine makes, every potential maintenance issue that looms in the distance, because now the consequences of neglect fall entirely on you. The liberation you expected transforms into a new form of captivity, one where you feel personally responsible for keeping this object functional and valuable. Even possessions as simple as clothes or gadgets behave this way. Once something is yours, you feel obligated to preserve it, use it wisely, and ensure it doesn't deteriorate, whereas something you borrowed carried none of this psychological weight. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to be related to our sense of extended self and personal accountability. When something belongs to us, we integrate it into our identity and sense of agency in the world, which means its condition reflects back on us as a measure of our competence and care. You don't wake up one morning and suddenly feel burned out, which is precisely what makes it so insidious and difficult to recognize until it has already taken root in every corner of your life. Instead, burnout arrives like a slow fade, a gradual dimming of your internal light that happens so incrementally that you convince yourself you're simply being more realistic, more mature, more aware of life's demands. You used to feel energized by your work, but now you notice the energy is gone, replaced by a kind of hollow persistence where you show up and do the thing without any sense of purpose or satisfaction attached to it. The passion that once drove you has been replaced by obligation, and somewhere along the way, you stopped noticing when that exchange happened. You tell yourself you're just tired, that everyone feels this way, that this is what adulting actually looks like beneath the motivational Instagram posts and success stories that flood your feed. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple. When you consistently demand more from yourself than you are willing to give back in rest, recovery, and genuine care, your system begins to operate on a deficit. Your mind and body keep functioning, but they function in a kind of emergency mode, a state that was never designed to be permanent, yet we have normalized it as the baseline expectation of modern professional life. By the time burnout becomes obvious enough that you cannot ignore it anymore, it has already rewired your relationship to the things you once loved, and the cruelest part is that recognizing it often means you must fundamentally change your life in ways that feel terrifying or impossible. Yet the paradox is that the longer you wait to acknowledge it, the more drastic those changes must become. A missed promotion suddenly seems preferable to another year of the grind, or a career you spent a decade building no longer feels worth the cost of your own dissolution. You lie in bed at night, unable to sleep, because your mind keeps generating a persistent guilt about the hours you are not working, the emails you are not answering, the projects sitting incomplete on your desk, and you tell yourself that you are wasting time, that productive people do not rest, that sleep is a necessary evil to be minimized rather than embraced. And so you fight against your body's most fundamental need with caffeine and stimulation and the constant checking of your phone. This is the modern condition, the belief that your value as a human being is directly proportional to your output, That rest is something earned only after exhaustion has made you useless, and that taking time to simply exist without producing something tangible is a form of laziness or self-indulgence. Yet the mechanism at work here is straightforward and observable. Your brain consolidates memories during sleep, your immune system strengthens itself during rest, your hormones regulate themselves through proper sleep cycles, your emotional resilience rebuilds itself when you are not awake and depleting it, and your capacity for creative problem-solving actually increases after adequate rest rather than decreasing. The science is not new and it is not disputed, and yet we have constructed an entire culture around the denial of this basic reality, around the glorification of exhaustion as a marker of dedication and worth, around the notion that the most successful people are those who sleep the least and work the most. We have normalized a state of perpetual depletion, calling it ambition, calling it commitment, calling it sacrifice, when in fact what we are doing is systematically destroying our own neurological function in service of a false religion of productivity that measures everything in units of output and nothing in units of well-being. When you walk into a room and see two people of roughly the same age, one radiant and open and the other closed off and hardened, you're witnessing not merely a difference in personality, but the visible effects of prolonged emotional states written across the human form. The bitter person carries their resentment in the tightness around their mouth, in the permanent furrow between their eyebrows, in the way their shoulders curve inward as if protecting something wounded inside. Bitterness is a corrosive emotion that does not simply occupy the mind, but commandeers the entire body, recruiting the nervous system into a state of chronic tension and vigilance, as if the person is perpetually braced against an attack that happened years ago. Over months and years, this sustained muscular contraction etches itself into the face and posture, creating the appearance of accelerated aging that no skincare product can reverse. The bitter person finds themselves caught in a feedback loop where their facial expression reflects their internal state, and that hardened expression actually reinforces the bitterness by sending signals back to the brain that reinforce the emotional pattern, as neuroscience has increasingly demonstrated. What makes this particularly insidious is that bitterness often feels justified, even righteous, because it typically stems from genuine wrongs, real betrayals, or legitimate suffering that the person experienced. We have somehow normalized the idea that holding on to grievance is an appropriate response to injustice, when in fact the person who was wronged is merely extending the injury by refusing to release it, turning themselves into a living monument to their own suffering. The bitter person believes they are punishing those who hurt them, but instead they are simply choosing to remain in the prison long after the cell door has been left open. Watch an elderly person light up when discussing something they've never understood before, and you'll witness a biological truth that society largely ignores. The act of genuine curiosity appears to preserve mental elasticity and cognitive function in ways that passive contentment simply cannot match. When someone stops asking questions about the world, stops wondering how things work, stops pursuing knowledge that serves no immediate survival purpose, their mind enters a kind of stasis where neural pathways calcify and degrade at an accelerated rate, a phenomenon that neuroscientists have documented through measuring brain plasticity and cognitive decline in aging populations. The mechanism operates through a simple but profound principle. Curiosity requires the brain to engage in prediction and pattern recognition, to build new neural connections, to challenge existing frameworks and integrate novel information, and this constant mental friction generates the very conditions that keep cognitive functions from deteriorating, much like how muscles atrophy without use, but strengthen through repeated challenge and stress. Yet despite this clear biological advantage, modern society has constructed an entire apparatus designed to systematically extinguish curiosity in most people by the time they reach adulthood, replacing wonder with routine, questions with answers delivered through screens, and exploration with predetermined paths and predetermined outcomes. We celebrate youth for its curiosity while simultaneously punishing people for asking too many questions at work, for pursuing knowledge outside their narrow specialization, for spending time learning things that won't increase their earning potential or social status. And so we gradually condition ourselves to stop wondering about anything beyond the immediate and necessary. We spend months crafting 5-year plans, building spreadsheets with quarterly milestones, researching markets and competitors and optimal timing, only to watch reality unfold in ways our spreadsheets never anticipated. Yet somehow the people who succeed are rarely the ones who plan the most meticulously, but rather those who could pivot on a dime when circumstances demanded it. The brutal truth that most people never internalize is that the world operates in real-time chaos while our plans exist in static theoretical frameworks, and no amount of preparation can account for the emergence of new technologies, sudden market shifts, personal setbacks, unexpected opportunities, or the simple fact that other people have plans too, and sometimes theirs collide catastrophically with ours. We watch successful entrepreneurs discuss how they completely abandoned their original business model 3 times before finding what actually worked. Yet we still cling to the idea that more planning, more research, more consideration will somehow grant us immunity from having to adapt. The mechanism at work here is that our brains are pattern-matching machines that find comfort in the illusion of control, and planning gives us that feeling even when the plan itself becomes obsolete the moment reality interferes with it. So we confuse the process of planning with the outcome of success when really they are almost orthogonal concerns. Adaptability is harder to quantify than a business plan is, harder to present to investors or justify to ourselves, and far more uncomfortable because it requires admitting that we cannot know what we will need to do until the moment arrives and demands action. Yet we have normalized extensive planning as the responsible approach, while dismissing adaptability as reactive and unprofessional, when in fact the most adaptive person in the room is usually the one making the decisions that actually matter. Consider the moment when two people find themselves in conflict, voices rising, positions hardening, each person convinced of their rightness and the other's wrongness, and you realize that despite all the words being exchanged, nothing is actually being resolved or understood. Arguments rarely help because they operate under a fundamental misunderstanding about how human beings actually change their minds or soften their positions. When we argue, we believe we are engaged in the pursuit of truth, but what is actually happening is that both parties are defending their identity, their ego, their sense of being right, and the more aggressively you attack someone's position, the more fiercely they cling to it as a matter of self-preservation rather than logic. The psychological mechanism at work is called cognitive dissonance reduction, where people double down on their existing beliefs when they feel threatened by opposing information, and an argument is essentially a threat to someone's worldview wrapped in the language of debate. We have somehow normalized the idea that if we just find the right words, speak more forcefully, present better evidence, or raise our voice at the correct volume, we will finally convince the other person. Yet the evidence throughout human history suggests almost the opposite is true. People rarely change their minds because of arguments. They change their minds when they feel safe, respected, heard, and when they have time and space to arrive at new conclusions on their own terms without the pressure of an opponent waiting to declare victory. Arguments create winners and losers, and no one wants to be the loser, so even if someone might have been open to your perspective in a neutral moment, the moment an argument begins, their neural pathways shift into defense mode, their amygdala activates, their reasoning becomes clouded, and you are no longer speaking to the rational part of their mind, but to the part that. There exists a peculiar dynamic in human conversation where the person who speaks the most is often perceived as the most intelligent, confident, or valuable in the room, yet the opposite is almost always true in practice. Consider the scenario of a business meeting where one participant sits quietly, observes the patterns of conversation, notes the unspoken tensions, and understands the real concerns beneath the surface statements, while another person fills every silence with opinions, corrections, and declarations of their own expertise. By the end of the meeting, the second person feels satisfied that they have contributed meaningfully, but the first person has gathered more actual information, identified the real problems, and positioned themselves to be more useful going forward. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is straightforward. When you speak, you are broadcasting what you already know, which teaches nothing new to anyone including yourself. But when you listen, you receive information that you did not previously possess, and you learn how other people think, what they value, and what they fear. Every word you speak reduces the percentage of the conversation that belongs to discovery and increases the percentage that belongs to performance. Yet we have normalized the opposite belief entirely, constructing entire educational systems and social hierarchies around the ability to articulate quickly and dominantly, rewarding the loudest voices and the fastest talkers, punishing silence as a sign of stupidity or weakness rather than recognizing it as the posture of genuine learning. We fill pauses in conversation as though they are wounds that must be cauterized immediately, interpreting the other person's quietness not as attentiveness, but as disinterest or judgment. There exists a peculiar human tendency to remain in situations that no longer serve us, to continue investing energy in relationships that have grown hollow, to keep fighting battles we have already lost, and to persist in conversations that only drain our emotional reserves without offering resolution or growth. We sit across from people who have repeatedly disappointed us and speak the same words we spoke last week, hoping somehow this time will yield a different outcome, and when it does not, we blame ourselves for not explaining clearly enough, not loving enough, not trying hard enough. We stay in jobs that corrode our sense of purpose. We maintain friendships with people who only appear when they need something. We invest in projects that demand everything and return nothing. We pursue goals that never quite materialize because we have already committed so much that leaving feels like admitting failure. The mechanism behind this is deceptively simple. The human mind calculates loss differently than gain. Once we have invested time, money, emotion, or identity into something, our brain perceives leaving as a loss, and loss triggers far more resistance than the prospect of future gain ever could. We become trapped not by the situation itself, but by the sunk cost we have already paid, believing that one more conversation, one more month, one more attempt might somehow justify what we have already given. Yet the peculiar discovery that most people make only after leaving is that the situation did not actually improve because of their departure. Rather, their absence revealed how little their staying was actually helping. The other person continues or adapts, the situation resolves without them, or it collapses precisely because it was unsustainable all along, and their presence was merely postponing the inevitable. There comes a moment in most lives when the structure you've built begins to collapse, and you stand at the edge of a void that demands you start from nothing again. It might be a career that implodes after years of investment, a relationship that dissolves despite your efforts, a financial position that crumbles, or a version of yourself that no longer fits the world around you. The peculiar cruelty of these moments is not merely that they happen, but that they happen repeatedly, often when you believed you had finally arrived at some form of permanence. You rebuild, you stabilize, you create foundations that feel solid, and then some combination of circumstance, choice, or simply the relentless forward motion of time requires you to deconstruct everything and begin again from the ground level. What makes this experience psychologically significant is the pattern of disbelief that accompanies it each time. Our minds resist the notion that starting over is a natural feature of existence rather than an aberration, a sign of failure or proof that we are uniquely unlucky. We construct narratives of linear progress, imagining that life should move only forward and upward, that arriving at a certain age or achievement level should grant us immunity from reset. Yet the mechanism underlying this repeated pattern is simple and inevitable. Growth requires cycles of destruction and reconstruction, circumstances change independent of our planning, and the skills that served us in one era often become liabilities in the next. We have come to speak of starting over as though it were a rare catastrophe rather than the default rhythm of human experience, normalizing the fiction that life should be a smooth trajectory while simultaneously living through the evidence that it is not. Most people move through their lives with their attention fixed on the grand gestures, the major decisions, the pivotal moments they believe will define everything. They save their energy for the job interview, the marriage proposal, the business launch, the dramatic confrontation they've rehearsed in their minds 1,000 times. Yet if you observe the texture of an actual human existence closely enough, you will notice that the vast majority of what shapes a person's trajectory emerges not from these celebrated peaks, but from the accumulation of microscopic choices repeated endlessly across years. A single coffee spilled on your shirt in the morning sets a different emotional tone that affects how you treat a stranger later that day, which affects whether they smile at someone else, which ripples forward in ways you will never know. The small word of encouragement you almost didn't say, the phone call you almost didn't make, the 2 minutes of attention you almost withheld because you were tired, these become the invisible architecture of other people's resilience. In relationships, marriages crumble not from single catastrophic betrayals, but from the 10,000 tiny indifferences, the gradually shortened conversations, the progressively delayed responses, each one individually insignificant and collectively devastating. In personal growth, people do not transform through sudden epiphanies, but through the compounding effects of unremarkable daily habits practiced when nobody is watching and when the immediate feedback is non-existent. The person who reads one paragraph daily will live inside a fundamentally different intellectual universe than someone who reads nothing, yet this difference builds across years rather than appearing overnight. We have normalized our blindness to this pattern because small things provide no immediate dopamine hit, no story to tell, no visible evidence of progress, and so our brains categorize them as unimportant. There exists a peculiar pattern in human relationships where the grand romantic gesture, the elaborate apology, the sweeping declaration of love or commitment begins with tremendous emotional weight and significance, but gradually loses its power until it becomes almost invisible in the landscape of daily life. You receive flowers on an anniversary and feel deeply moved, but by the following week, those same flowers have wilted and been discarded, and the gesture itself has faded from your conscious memory almost as quickly as the petals fell. Someone plans an elaborate surprise birthday celebration with months of preparation, coordinating dozens of people and logistics, and in that moment it feels like the most meaningful thing anyone has ever done, yet within days or weeks it becomes just another story, another photograph in a phone, another memory that has lost its emotional texture. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in the neurobiology of novelty and adaptation. The human nervous system is fundamentally designed to notice change and become habituated to consistency, meaning that extraordinary events create a spike in emotional activation that inevitably normalizes as the brain categorizes the experience as part of the established baseline. A gesture that required months of planning and emotional intensity exists, once completed, in the same temporal space as all other completed events, and therefore it recedes into the background of our psychological landscape with remarkable efficiency. We understand this intellectually, and yet we continue to place an extraordinary amount of faith in big gestures as though they exist outside the laws of human psychology and time, as though the magnitude of an action can somehow protect it from the universal process of fade. Consider the person who wakes at 5 in the morning without an alarm, not because they have to, but because their body has been trained through repetition to expect this moment, and their mind has learned to associate dawn with purpose, and their nervous system has been conditioned through years of consistency to anticipate the days beginning before consciousness fully arrives. Now consider the person who sleeps until noon, whose habits have taught their body that time is negotiable, that momentum is optional, that the day belongs to whoever arrives to meet it whenever they choose. These two people are not fundamentally different in capacity or potential, yet their daily rhythms have become so ingrained through habit that they now inhabit almost separate realities. The mechanism is remarkably simple. Every action we repeat creates neural pathways that strengthen with each iteration, and these pathways eventually become the default route your brain travels without conscious thought or decision. A habit is simply a behavior that your brain has decided is so important or so frequent that it no longer requires active deliberation, and this automation frees mental energy for other tasks, which is evolutionarily efficient but personally consequential. What makes this brutal is that habits operate beneath the threshold of our awareness most of the time, shaping our identity without our permission or recognition, so that we become the sum total of our unconscious rituals rather than the architects of our own narrative. We have normalized this phenomenon so thoroughly that we speak of people as if their habits are their personality, describing someone as lazy or disciplined or ambitious, as though these were immutable traits rather than accumulated behavioral patterns that could theoretically be rewired with sufficient intention. You spend decades building something you believe will outlast you, whether it is a business, a body of work, a reputation, or a set of values you try to pass down through your family, and yet within 2 or 3 generations, almost none of it remains recognizable in the way you intended it to be. The founder's name fades from the company long before the company itself fades. The artist's work gets reinterpreted by scholars who never knew their voice. The family stories become distorted through retelling until they bear almost no resemblance to what actually happened, and the principles you held sacred get abandoned by your grandchildren who face different circumstances and different pressures that make your wisdom seem quaint and irrelevant. This happens not because people are ungrateful or because your legacy was weak, but because time itself is corrosive, because each generation must solve its own problems rather than merely inherit yours, because memory requires constant maintenance, and most people are too busy surviving their present moment to be proper custodians of the past. The psychological mechanism is simple and brutal. What mattered to you matters to almost no one else, and what will matter to your descendants will be shaped by forces you cannot predict or control. We have normalized this forgetting by pretending we do not see it happening, by speaking about legacy as though it is something solid and eternal, when in reality it is something fragile that begins dissolving the moment you stop actively defending it. Even the greatest figures in history are reduced to Wikipedia summaries and misquoted aphorisms, their complexities flattened, their struggles forgotten, their actual voices replaced by whatever narrative serves the current generation's needs. You spend your entire life waiting for something else to happen, postponing the experience of being alive until some arbitrary future date when conditions align perfectly. When you have enough money, when you find the right person, when you finish the project, when you lose the weight, when you reach the promotion, and yet that moment never quite arrives because the goalpost simply shifts the moment you approach it, and what remains is a kind of perpetual dissatisfaction with where you are right now. A constant nagging sense that real life is happening somewhere else, to someone else, at some other time. You sit in a beautiful place with people you care about, and instead of experiencing it, you document it, you plan the next gathering, you worry about work waiting on your phone. Your mind fractures across yesterday's argument and tomorrow's deadline, while the only moment you actually possess slips through your fingers like water. The psychological mechanism underlying this pattern is that your brain evolved to be a problem-solving machine, always scanning ahead for threats and opportunities, always running simulations of future scenarios, and this capability that once kept your ancestors alive now traps you in a perpetual state of temporal displacement, where the present moment feels like merely a waypoint between more important times rather than the only time you ever actually experience anything. You have convinced yourself that suffering through the present moment in service of a future moment makes sense, that delayed gratification is wisdom, that being here now is laziness or irresponsibility, but this belief persists despite the obvious brutality of its logic. You are giving away the only currency you actually have in exchange for a future that arrives as another present moment you will also fail to inhabit, and you will continue this pattern until death, having spent a lifetime almost entirely somewhere other than where you actually. We stand at the threshold of closure and tell ourselves it is destruction, yet every ending that has ever occurred in your life has been immediately followed by a beginning, whether you recognized it or not. When you leave a job, you do not simply vanish into void. You enter a new phase where you are no longer bound by those particular constraints, and suddenly time reorganizes itself, habits dissolve, and possibilities that were previously invisible become tangible. When a relationship concludes, what actually ends is not your capacity to connect or love, but rather one specific configuration of those capacities, and in that death lives the birth of a different version of yourself, one shaped by what you learned and what you survived. The mechanism operating beneath this phenomenon is simple and absolute. There is no such thing as genuine stasis in nature. Energy does not disappear, it transforms. Matter does not vanish, it recombines. The cells in your body are constantly dying and being replaced, yet you persist, changed but continuous. Your beliefs evolve through contradiction and collapse. Your relationships transform through conflict and distance. Your ambitions reshape themselves through failure and loss. What we call endings are merely violent transformations where the old form can no longer hold and must break open to release something new. Yet we have normalized the experience of endings as purely tragic, as losses to be mourned without acknowledgement of what they simultaneously create. We speak of moving on as though we are escaping from something, rather than recognizing that we are always moving into something. This resistance to the dual nature of endings persists despite overwhelming evidence precisely because grief is louder than growth, and loss commands more of our attention than emergence. The pain of what is gone drowns out the quiet potential of what is beginning.